These lectures are titled Theories of Human Development, Part 1.
Hello, my name is Malcolm Watson, and it's my pleasure and privilege to guide you through this course on theories of human development. In this introductory lecture, I would like to accomplish several things. First, I would like to give you some major objectives for the course. I'm hoping that the objectives that I've come up with will be incorporated into your objectives as students, and that these will be part of what you're looking for to gain from this course. And then I'd like to give you the definition of two important concepts for the course. The first is a definition of human development, and the second is a definition of scientific theories. And then we will talk about the value of scientific theories, particularly as they apply to human development. And then I would like to give you a set of criteria that you can use when you're judging any given theory to judge whether it's a good theory or not. And we'll conclude this introduction with an overview of what we're going to cover in the rest of the course. So first, let me give you these objectives. As I see it, the first objective for you as a student is to grasp the value of developmental theories by becoming familiar with the 6 theories that I'm going to talk about. These 6 theories have perhaps had the greatest and the most widespread influence on our current conceptions of child development, of any theories that we've had, and on our influence, our thinking and our views of human nature in general. The second objective is for you as a student to learn about sequences and processes of human development as you learn about these 6 theories. We're talking about theories, but along the way, I hope you'll pick up some information about children and adults and how we develop. And the third objective is for you to be able to be a critical judge of the value of these different theories. I want you to come away being a healthy skeptic, so to speak, that you will see the value of different theories, but at the same time you can judge also the weaknesses of theories, and you can compare theories and see where they converge, where we could actually integrate them, and also where they differ from each other. So with that in mind, let me give you 2 important definitions. The first is human development. Human development can be defined simply as the sequence of stages and processes that bring about change and reorganization in humans from their conception through their entire life cycle. Now notice I said the sequence of changes and the processes. Human development discusses both the order of change, the sequence, and the underlying processes or mechanisms that explain how this change occurs. Human development applies to both growth and also to reorganizations. In terms of growth, if we add height or we get heavier, that's development, that's growth. If we increase certain skills, for example, we increase our vocabulary size, that's development. But I think the most important and the most interesting aspects of development really focus on reorganizations in our thinking, changes that in how we approach or the tasks in life, the strategies that we use. The reorganizations are not necessarily just additions or growth. We restructure things. Let me give you an example. This happened to me recently. I was observing a class of preschoolers, and for about 20 minutes I'd been talking to one little girl and getting to know her, and I was asking her questions, and we were getting along pretty well, and she was talking to me, and she began to explain to me about her recent birthday, that she had just turned 4 years of age. And she talked about how on Saturday she had had this great birthday party, and about all the gifts she had received and all the people that were at the party. And then she paused, sort of shocked. She looked at me and said, "Why weren't you at my birthday party?" And I sort of looked shocked and looked back at her, and then I realized, oh, there's a kid. And I said, well, You see, I just met you 20 minutes ago. I didn't know you before that. I didn't even know you were having a birthday party. Now, this is typical of kids of about 3 to 4 years of age. They have what people call a lack of perspective-taking ability. What this entails is they have a real problem taking account of what somebody else knows and comparing that to what they know, the information that they know. And they get confused about how much somebody else knows, how much they know. In this case, this little girl got confused about what I knew. If I were talking to her and we were friends, as she thought, and she sort of liked me, I think she did, then I should have been at her birthday party. You see how she got confused with that? The lack of perspective taking then is considering kids can take perspectives. What they can't do is coordinate them and look at the perspective they have in comparison and in coordination with the perspective or viewpoint that somebody else has. Now, by the time they get to be 5 or 6 or 5 to 7 in that time, they have practiced this, they've developed this. I think cognitively there are changes, and now they're pretty good at it. But this reorganization, then being able to take perspectives, is not really what you'd call growth, or in addition, it's really a shift in strategy. It's a reorganization in the way they approach this particular task. That's an example of development that I think is quite interesting, and that people that study development are trying to assess. Now, the reorganizations that we call development occur in many domains of our lives. They occur neurologically, physically, cognitively, emotionally, and socially. All of this is development. And although development occurs throughout the entire lifespan, most of the changes, most of the reorganizations that occur happen during childhood and adolescence. Change happens faster, and I think more of it. So it should not surprise you that child development is really a large subset of all of human development. Now, some people could say, well, I want to learn about adult development. I want to learn about development in old age. But we really can't fully understand our human nature and what we're like as a species if we don't also understand our origins and how we developed and the processes and principles we went through of getting from the beginning to where we're at any particular time or given point in our development, whatever age we are. One needs to understand children and their development to understand the full human. In fact, you could say, in a metaphoric way, the adult still has the child within him or her, and the child always potentially has the adult already there in place. We're all the same species, after all. The study of human development comes from many different disciplines. This is truly an interdisciplinary kind of study. It comes from medicine. People have contributed from biology, from education, from anthropology, from philosophy, and I'm sure I've missed some. However, developmental psychologists have probably contributed the largest portion of research and theorizing about human development. The 6 major theories and the theorists that we're going to study in this course came primarily from the field of developmental psychology. Even if they weren't trained in developmental psychology, that is in fact where they were doing their work. So expect to hear a lot of psychology and developmental aspects that come here, even though it's all mixed in with people from other domains. In fact, I have to tell you that if you go to a conference of developmentalists today, in most of these conferences, you're going to find educators, physicians, sociologists, therapists, psychologists, biologists, a whole group of people. Let me give you the second definition, that of scientific theories. A scientific theory is a systematic explanation that unifies various observed phenomena and facts. That seems simple. You see, we have a lot of information out there that we bring in through our senses. We have a lot of facts and data. But the theory is what puts it all together and tries to make sense of it. A scientific theory is forever striving, as scientists are, to not only describe what's out there, but to explain the causes, what the processes are or mechanisms, and what causes lead to what end results. Developmental theories, as do other scientific theories, provide us with metaphors, models, and formulas for understanding and predicting developmental processes and how development will progress from under any particular given set of circumstances. Even if we only have metaphors and they're not so precise as we'd like, they still can be extremely helpful in helping us to unify our findings and to understand our findings. Now, no theory provides us with a perfect explanation or model of reality. Of course, that's true. But without theories, we don't even make any progress in our understanding. We can't even use the facts that we've gleaned. I feel very strongly about that. I want to stress that. Without a theory, we go nowhere. We cannot organize and unify the facts, the data, the phenomena that we observe. We have to put it together in some way that we can simplify it and organize it and explain it. So whether you think of yourself as a theorist or not, we're all theorists and we all need theories. In fact, this is handy because I think it's part of the way we are built as humans. It's part of our species to have this strong tendency to want to classify and organize the world. We can't help ourselves. We're constantly organizing things. We are what's called in the field naive theorists. Not that we're also naive, but even if we're not trained in an area, we're theorizing. So we all do that, whether we recognize it or not. Let me give you an example of this kind of reorganization that you constantly see. Somebody showed me this once. I thought it worked really well for me, and I think if you set up this experiment and did it for yourself, you'd find it would work for you. This person brought in a string of Christmas tree lights, and the lights were different colors, and they would flash and blink on and off randomly. The whole thing was just blinking on and off. But the person didn't lay them out in any organized order. He just had them clumped over his arm. It was just a big cluster of this string of lights. And we in the audience looked at it for a while, and not much happened. It was just random firing. And then he turned on some music. And first he put on a piece by Beethoven. And within a very short period of time, within a minute, the music had this magical effect. It organized the lights, and they started forming a pattern. In fact, they were in complete concordance with the music. They formed the pattern of blinking that was in the same tempo as the music and went with the nuances of the music. It was sort of amazing. But then he switched off that music, and he put on a piece by John Coltrane, a piece of modern jazz, my favorite. And within another short period of time, in less than a minute, the lights became reorganized again and started going to the tempo of the new music and showing the nuances of the new music. Isn't that amazing how sound can actually reorganize light? Actually, it didn't happen, as you could realize. It wasn't that anything changed in the lights. It was inside. It was in our minds. And what happened for me happened for everybody else there too. We reorganized our thinking because when we saw this jumbled mess, this random pattern, I would argue we don't like that. We don't like confusion as humans. And even when we're not trying to, even when we're unconscious of it, we tend to organize our world. And that's what we did. Our minds did it automatically, looking for patterns, constantly looking for patterns. So that's handy. Since we have that tendency anyway, it makes sense that we're going to develop theories. Now, I want to give you a test at this point. You're thinking, oh, darn, I didn't want to have a test on the first day of class. But here it is. This is actually a quick test to help you to determine where you stand on some of the major issues in development. Because I want to point out that I believe you all have naive theories already, or conceptions, a sense of what children are like and what human nature is like. and aspects that relate to development in some of the theories that we're going to talk about. And maybe this is a way, if you try to answer these, at least in your mind, if you answer these honestly from your gut level feelings, maybe you can figure out where you stand on this. So let me give you the first question. These are multiple choice questions, okay, with alternatives. So first, children are A, creatures whose basically negative or selfish impulses must be controlled. Or B, neither inherently good nor inherently bad. Or C, creatures who are born with many positive and few negative tendencies. If you have to choose, what's your gut feel about that? Now, if you chose A, creatures are basically negative and selfish, then in fact, you're in good company. There are many early theorists and conceptions that took this view. And in fact, one of the theorists we're going to talk about, Freud, had this view, the foundation of his theory, that we're selfish. He didn't mean that really in a morally derogatory way, but that we have these inherent qualities that start us out. If you had the alternative, we're neither good nor bad, we're neutral, you're also in good company, because there are a lot of people early on that had this conception. John Locke is one of the philosophers we're going to talk about that had this view. And there are other theorists, including Bandura's theory that we're going to talk about and others, that really are based on this neutral view. If you took alternative C, that children are creatures who are born with many positive traits and few negative, you're all again in good company. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this view. And some of the theorists we're talking about also are based on this foundation, particularly Jean Piaget's theory. Let me go on to the second question. Here it is. People are basically A, active beings who play a major role in determining their own abilities and traits. Or B, passive beings whose characteristics are molded by either environmental or biological factors. When I say active beings, I don't mean that we don't move around and walk and run. Active beings who play a major role in determining their own abilities and traits. Or are they passive in the sense that they're molded by their environment or their biology? Now, if you said A, you then are following a line that's a view of the world, an approach to human nature called the organismic approach, that views people as actors and initiators of their own development and processes. If you said B, you're following an approach called the mechanistic approach that looks at humans as more reactionary to things that then from the outside influence them. And we're going to talk about the organismic and the mechanistic approach in a future lecture. Let me give you the third question. When we compare the development of different individuals, we see A, mainly similarities. People develop along universal paths and experience similar changes at similar ages. Or B, mainly differences. People undergo different sequences of change and have widely different timetables of development. Both are there, right? But you're forced to choose. What do you mainly focus on? If you say A, that you're looking for similarities and universals in development, again, you're in line with an organismic approach and with the research and the theories of several important theorists, such as Jean Piaget. If you said B, looking mainly for differences and the different timetables and the different changes that people experience, you're in line with a more mechanistic approach and with other theorists, such as Bandura. So we'll come back to this. Let me give you the last question. Biological influences and environmental influences are thought to contribute to development. Look, anybody who's smart knows that we have both nature and nurture, biology and environment, that influence how we develop and who we are. We have both. Everybody knows that. Everybody always knew that. But here's the question. overall, A, biological factors contribute more than environmental factors. B, biological and environmental factors are equally important. Or C, environmental factors contribute more than biological factors. Now you recognize this as a question or an issue of nature and nurture. In the field of development, nature and nurture is a really big question and issue. And as we go through different theories, I think you'll be able to see that some theories maybe stress one over the other. And look at these things. I gave you these questions because I want you to see, if you've really tried to come up with your views, that you have viewpoints to begin with. Without ever going through this course, you have some approaches to human development. All of the theorists that we talk about in here have conceptions of children, and they did have conceptions even before they came up with their theories. We all have what are called these naive theories of human nature and of child development. And you can then see if some of these issues come up again, as I believe they will, when you learn about these different theorists. I also want to return to this by the end of the course and see if you change your mind on any of your views here. Scientists use different criteria to judge whether a theory is a good theory or not. By a good theory, I mean, does it work? Is it valuable to us in organizing and explaining and unifying the data and the phenomena that we have? I'm going to give you a set of questions to ask, that if you keep this set of questions and as you go through and learn about different theories, you can apply this and ask it about different theories and see if you can answer generally yes to most of the questions regarding a certain theory, and you can make a judgment, well, that's a pretty good theory, or it isn't a pretty good theory. So here they are. The first one is, does the theory reflect the real world of humans, particularly children? You see, even before we start, a theory ought to have what's called face validity. It ought to some way match your own personal experiences in your life and the experiences you've had with children and with other people, as we've all had. It should seem to make sense to you and match what you've experienced with them. If it really seems like it's from another planet, you have to question, is it really a good theory? Is that theorist in fact in touch with children? Second question is the theory supported by convincing evidence? Remember here, we're talking about scientific theories. Anybody could come up with a theory. It could be crazy. It could be whacked out. Again, from another planet. A good scientific theory is tied to empirical, observable evidence. It should explain it. It should match it, at least to some degree. The third question for your criteria is, does a theory explain the past and predict future outcomes? So theories are devised to explain what we already know, but a really good theory will also predict things that will come about later. A good theory, like Einstein's in physics, predicted the pathways and orbits of planets, predicted things that would happen in the universe. When the periodic table was developed as a theory to explain the orderliness and organization of elements, they could predict where new elements would be found and what those elements would be like, the characteristics of those elements. It was a good theory because it worked in that way. And along with that question, the fourth question is, can the theory handle new data and new discoveries? So a good theory ought to be able to handle whatever else comes along. Fifth question is, does the theory stimulate new research and new discoveries? Let me give you an example. We're going to talk about attachment theory. But when Bowlby and Ainsworth came up with attachment theory to talk about infant-parent relationships, that theory then stimulated a whole slew of articles, hundreds of articles, to find how early attachment or the type of attachment a child had predicted outcomes of either developing in a proper, or I should say optimal way, or developing some pathologies and some problems. It stimulated that research and those discoveries. The same thing. When Piaget came up with this idea of perspective taking or the lack of perspective taking, like in the example of the girl in the birthday party, it stimulated hundreds of research articles and studies to look at how it would develop and how that might explain things like how we learn to compete with others, how we learn to cooperate with others, how we learn to be able to make attributions and guesses on what somebody else is thinking and what they intend to do. All of those things came out of his theory. The sixth question is the theory clearly understandable? Does it simplify rather than complicate the world? Remember, it's supposed to simplify. If you can't keep it in your head, if it makes no sense to you, no matter how many times you go through it, you just can't keep it around. It's complicated things. I don't think it's a very good theory. And the last question, number 7, is the theory self-satisfying? That seems like a strange question, isn't it? You see, a lot of the best theorists believe that theories, just like art or music, have to have an aesthetic quality to them. They have to move you emotionally. That's what a good theory does to theorists. And in some sense, we ought to have some self-satisfaction. We ought to have some emotional reaction to a good theory. Doesn't sound like science, but that's what other people use. Einstein was coming up with trying to come up with an equation that would explain this strange orbit of Mercury around the sun, and also to try to explain gravity, and it became part of his general theory of relativity. When he came up with an equation that in fact worked, he was very excited. He purportedly said to a student of his, "It would have been too bad for God if the theory had been subsequently disproved." And later on he said, "The equation was so beautiful it had to be true." Isn't that a funny thing? It was so beautiful it just had to be true. He loved the beauty of it. And Paul Dirac, who was a British physicist, went even further than Einstein. He once said, "It is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment." We just said it's important to fit evidence, but for him, beauty was everything. Now, theories, let me give you a caveat, a caution. Theories are necessary, can organize and clarify our conceptions, but they can also bias our outlooks. They can blind us to additional facts, and they often do that. That's the price we pay for having theories. Somebody once said, a theory is a lot like a camera taking a picture. By taking a picture, we bring into sharp focus what's in the picture, but the picture then denies the existence and the reality of everything outside the frame. You ignore it. And in some ways, that seems to be what we do with theories. We take the good with the bad. That's why it's important to evaluate them. Sometimes a theory will oversimplify. We want to simplify, but sometimes it will oversimplify the reality of the world. Let me conclude now by just running you through an overview of what the rest of this course will entail. In the next 3 lectures, I would like to discuss the history of child study, particularly in Europe and America, and how we developed this sense and interest in studying children in a systematic way, and how this history actually led up to the major theorists that we're going to talk about. Because they each had a history and they each had a context, a cultural context in which they developed and grew up. And the history of child study and the history of each scientist made a difference and entered into the biases and the ways they formed their theories. So I think it's important to look at this history to begin with. After we do that, then we're going to discuss each of the 6 theories in turn and spend a few lectures on each one, and hopefully you'll learn more about them. And then at the end, I'm going to make some final comparisons and draw some conclusions regarding these theories. The 6 theories that we're going to cover are, first, the theory of Sigmund Freud, his psychodynamic theory. This theory focused mainly on unconscious processes, the development of the entire personality, and was the first one, really, to come along. Second, we'll discuss Erik Erikson's theory, the psychosocial theory of development, and how he modified and expanded on Freud's theory. And third, we'll discuss an integrated attachment theory that came about from John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. John Bowlby was a psychoanalyst, a Freudian, and he split from Freud's theory and went a different direction to develop his own. The fourth theory will be Albert Bandura's social learning theory, and he stressed the importance of observational learning in development. The fifth theory will be Jean Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, and we'll learn how he was part of a major revolution that considered cognitive processes as important in development. His was the most grand and far-reaching theory of everyone's. And the sixth and last theory will be Lev Vygotsky's cognitive mediation theory. He provided a wonderful complement to Piaget's cognitive theory, but a theory that also included social constructs. So next time we'll start with our history of child study. Thank you. Hello. In this second lecture and in the next two lectures, I'm going to cover the early history of child study, particularly in Europe and in America. I think in order to understand the various theories of development that we're going to focus on in this course, you need to understand the historical background and the cultural context in which they developed. This history of development is shown in 6 phases. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk particularly about phases 1 and 2, and I'll mention these phases in just a minute. Neurologically and physically, children have probably not changed much in thousands of years. They're basically the same. And yet, they obviously grew up in different contexts, in different cultural contexts, in different time eras, and interestingly, our perspective of their nature has changed, to the extent that it seems like when people looked at children and tried to describe them or explain how they were describing different species or a different creature from one time period to another time period. So in fact, the cultural context in which a child grows up and the particular historical period influences particular child rearing practices. The problems, the issues that a people or a culture face at any given time will influence the practices. And then these child rearing practices and these problems in turn influence the perspective of human nature that people have. But it's reciprocal. The perspective we have of human nature, how children are, then influence the way we treat them. And this is a reciprocal cyclical issue. The theories then that emerge come in part because of the historical context, because of the issues and problems of the day. To begin with, I mentioned that I was going to talk about this history of how we developed a sense of children and the interest in child study in Europe and America. But I would like to begin by comparing some different cultures and societies. And this work mainly comes from anthropological and archaeological studies. Anthropologists have studied what they consider the remnants of certain kinds of primitive societies to try to get a feel for how these societies might have functioned. So a lot of people believe that hunter-gatherer societies were the most primitive and the first kinds of societies that developed. In hunter-gatherer societies, people lived mainly in warm climates where food was abundant. They wandered around rather than staying in one place. And they could live pretty easily under these conditions. Now, the Kung Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa are examples of this kind of hunter-gatherer societies. We've studied them to the extent now, I don't know what they're like now, but at one time we studied them when they were really practicing this form of hunter-gatherer society. In these kinds of societies, like among the Kung Bushmen, children are kept close to the parents. They're considered very close to the parents. They have a very carefree life. They have an easy life. And the parents, in turn, are very attached to their children. The children are not given responsibilities. They're nurtured. They're tolerated. their activities, they're considered to be children and different than adults. And they're carried around. Part of this is brought about because the people live in nuclear families. It doesn't make a lot of economic or survival sense to have large societies or extended families. So nuclear families rule, and the children then are valued and carried. For example, among the Kung Bushmen, babies are usually nursed until they're about 3 or 4 years of age. Compare that now to agrarian societies that most people believe developed later. And people have studied rural Chinese agrarian societies as they existed some time ago. In agrarian societies, when people settled down, they in fact started forming larger extended families and larger societies. They were in one place, and the economic necessities required that they have a large workforce. And in these kinds of societies, the focus was on teaching people to be cooperative, teaching them responsibilities and to be part of the group and to be economic assets to the entire family or society. Children in these societies then were disciplined in a more harsh manner at earlier ages and were given fairly high responsibilities as young as 3 years of age. Children were often doing household chores, gardening, taking care of younger children. And this was a different outlook on children. Maybe it shouldn't surprise us then that children in these agrarian societies were treated more like adults. They were like miniature adults. They certainly were smaller. They didn't have as much experience. But for all intents and purposes, they functioned and thought and behaved like adults. At least that's how people in the society saw them. The third kind of society that developed were technological societies. And in technological societies, there was a switch back to nuclear families again. It didn't make economic sense to have large extended families, so nuclear families ruled with fewer children. At the same time, though, children were not an economic necessity. They were not cogs as part of the workforce or the machinery. In fact, children became, for the first time, financial liabilities. And children were treated differently in technological societies, especially in societies like ours today. They were considered not necessary, but a luxury and a very valued component. So children now were valued for some other reason, because of their potential, because of their inherent worth. And once again, especially now with the longer period of education required, children were not expected to grow up so fast or given so many responsibilities, and they were treated differently than adults were treated. Once again, they were children. In technological societies, no longer was it possible to have children be trained by apprenticeship models. It was different to have somebody trained to be a physician or an air traffic controller or an administrator than it was to have somebody trained to be a farmer or a carpenter. They now needed to go to school. So in technological societies, for the most part, the responsibility for the disciplining and the upbringing and the education of children is given to society and institutions such as schools, and not so much for the parents. Children are a luxury, but they're highly valued in their own right. There's more leisure to take care of them, and the period of childhood extends to take care of the education and take care of this leisure period. In fact, there have been periods in the past when we had no such category called adolescence or teenagers. Kids were children, then they were adults. Adolescents were invented when in fact we had a longer period of time before we needed them in the workforce, and they needed more education. I give that as a background because if you look at the attitude and the practices of child rearing and how people related to children in any particular period of time, it would depend on what kind of society they came from and the economic conditions. But now let's go back to Europe and America, because this is the history that influenced the big theorists that we're going to talk about in this course. This is where our history came from in terms of child development. And I want to start with a period of time at the pre-industrial and industrial revolution in Europe, a time when there really was a switch from an agrarian society to a technological society, but things were in flux. Things were really a mess as far as children are concerned. I mentioned that I was going to break this history up into phases. Let me give you the 6 phases that I'm going to cover. The first phase we can call a lack of concern for children. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. The second phase would be considered when a concern, an interest in children began to develop, but children were seen as being born evil and needing redemption. A third phase I have called the pre-empirical philosophy phase. It was influenced by some primary philosophers, mainly John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the influence they had on changing the pervading view from children being born evil to something else. The fourth phase is one of observational research, when science started and people actually started paying attention to collecting data and information in a systematic way about children. The fifth phase was the grand phase of theoretical science, the phase in which our theorists that we're going to talk about came from and developed their theories to explain development. And the sixth phase that we're in today can be called contemporary diversity. Theories still dominate, but no one theory. The field is so diverse, it's broken up into many, many areas, and we can't say that one theory has taken over. Let me go back now to talk about the first phase. The first phase I called a lack of concern for children. During this pre-industrial and industrial revolution, it seemed to be that there was not much interest, well, there was no interest in child study, but there wasn't much interest in children anyway. There seemed to be a lack of concern. Children were barely tolerated. To a great extent, they were disregarded. Now, did parents love their children and care about them? My guess is, of course, they did. But in many, many ways, it doesn't seem like they did. It had to be that some of them did. But compared to our society today, the number of problems, the way children were treated, was vastly different and would be considered deplorable and depraved by our conditions today. For one thing, there was an extremely high infant mortality rate. Children in much of Europe had only a 1 in 3 or a 1 in 4 chance of surviving to adulthood. So in the first place, most children were not going to make it past 6 years of age. There are also many examples given of the deplorable conditions and the high infant mortality rate. Let me give you a few. Now you could say, I'm just selecting certain examples. Well, I'm selecting examples from what we have available and what we can use. For example, in Paris in 1750, 33% of all the children who were born that year were left in foundling homes or on doorsteps, and most of them died. So, despite the fact that we already had a high infant mortality rate, in fact, maybe because of this condition, many, many of the children were given out. It seemed to be their form of birth control. In 1780 in Paris, there were 21,000 births. Of those 21,000 births, 700 babies were nursed by their own mothers. And the rest were either given to foundling homes or given out to wet nurses, hired out to people who would take on the job of nursing a lot of children. The conditions were so deplorable, the hygienic conditions, that most of these people, of these kids, died. And in fact, wet nurses then were given the nickname of killing nurses. In Dublin, between the years 1775 and 1800, so in a 25-year period, there were 10,272 births of kids that were left in foundling homes. Over 10,000 kids were placed in foundling homes. Of that number, 45 survived to adulthood. So it was virtually everybody left in a foundling home died. The conditions were so bad at this period of time for many years in Dublin that Jonathan Swift made this comment about it. Now, Jonathan Swift was a satirist, but even his satire here is a little extreme. This was really written, as he said, a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burden on their parents and on the country, and making them beneficial to the public. And here's what he said. He, by the way, got a jab in at Americans as well. He says, I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve as a fricassee. So his point was, rather than giving up these children to foundling homes to die, why don't we just eat them? Now, most people, if somebody said that today in our papers, wouldn't find that very funny, but conditions were tough. In England in this same time period, boys and girls were often sent to the mines to work, often as young as 4 and 5 years of age. One reason they were sent so young is because families needed the money. Everybody was poor. And they couldn't take care of all their kids. Their kids would go out and bring in some money. But the kids were also small. And they figured this was good because they could crawl through the little tunnels in the coal mines and the different kinds of mines. They often worked naked because it was so hot. Often would work all day, bend over, not being able to straighten up, working like pack mules, carrying carts with them. There is one case given of how to handle these kids that were in the mines when their eyesight failed. It said, grab them by the ears and bang their heads against the wall to straighten out their eyes. There was another piece of advice to parents on taking care of your children. Don't change their diapers very often, because if you change their diapers, this is the quote, would draw away the child's nourishing juices like a sponge. There were many, many cases of infants who were left by the fireplaces in the kitchens and caught fire and burned, of children being eaten by dogs and hogs in the barnyard and left to die in strange ways. So we think, well, they had disease. They had more than disease. It seemed to be a lack of concern, a lack of toleration for children, at least to an extent that we don't have today and would be appalled at. What was the cause of this lack of concern? And what effect do you think this had on people's perceptions of children? Well, we can never say completely what brought this about. But one speculation has been that when the chance of survival is extremely low, when the infant mortality rate is extremely high, children may not be as valued. And perhaps the reason is that the emotional investment it takes to get involved in children is too difficult when most of them die and can't make it. There is some evidence that people who have children who have medical problems and must be left in nurseries, even today, have a hard time knowing whether they should get close, whether they should withdraw, whether they should get emotionally attached if they don't know what's going to happen to the baby. They want to, but there is this problem, knowing they won't make it. Now, I haven't been around. You haven't been around to see what it would be like if you knew that most of your children would die, and these conditions were like this, but this may have added to it. When children did survive infancy, they were expected to work for the family. Keep in mind, this was a transition to a technological society, and we talked about the difference between agrarian and technological societies. This was a time of transition. Children were not needed as a cog of the workforce in terms of being on the farm. They were becoming a liability unless they were sent out to work. This whole process of not being tolerated and then being sent out to work may have then reinforced the perception that people seem to have of children, that they were like miniature adults. Again, they were smaller, they were less experienced, but they were not considered different cognitively, in the way they had developed from just being little adults. To give you an example, if you look at a baby lizard is like a miniature adult lizard. You don't really see much difference except in size. Well, think of children being like that. You can see this sometimes if you look at the way children were depicted in the art of the times. Now, the art of the times would be paintings were done by wealthier families, the nobility or the wealthy people. But even in these cases where children were treated better, they weren't sent out to the mines, for example, you still see children depicted smaller, but looking somewhat like adults, not looking like babies. And in fact, in some of the wealthiest of the society, in the nobility and in the courts of Europe, and particularly in France at the time, children were included in all the adult activities. They weren't excluded. They didn't have an R rating as we do today to protect children. If they had a wild, ribald party, the children were there. Anything that happened, they were exposed to. And in fact, there are cases given of children who were invited into parties that were really wild orgies and made to do really wild orgy-related sexual stuff for the amusement and entertainment of the adults that were there. There wasn't a sense that children needed protecting or needed to be treated in some way differently than the adults were treated. So this was a sad state of affairs. And you can think, it had to change. Times were ripe for a change. And I'd like to now talk about a second phase in this history of child study, and I think this was the change that came about. This was a growing concern for children. But in fact, this growing concern for children seemed to be a concern for children that was led mainly by religious leaders and a view that children were born evil and needed redemption. There were also physicians and some other enlightened people that helped to bring about this change. Let me give you one example. William Cadogan, in 1777, was a physician in England who published a book for parents on parenting. I guess you could say he was the Dr. Spock of his time. It was a book, and I've read some parts of it, and he had profound advice for parents. He said things like, change their diapers, give them fresh air, don't beat them up, give them nutritious food. Profound things to help parents to know how to be a better parent. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, though, a movement emerged that became known by many as the Sunday School movement. It was because of the pervading Christian religious beliefs that children were seen as being born evil, mainly because of original sin. And because of the way this was their nature and the way they were seen as being damned unless this evil was purged from them, unless they could some way be redeemed and changed. The idea was that, in fact, self-will had led Adam and Eve to go astray. Self-will was a bad thing. We had to bring these children under the subjugation of a more moral code, living for higher standards and not being the way they naturally were. But it did lead to education. Let me give you another quote from John Wesley, a famous and very influential religious leader of the time. He said, and he's talking about how we should treat children, break their wills betimes. Begin this work before they can run alone, before they can speak plain, perhaps before they can speak at all. Whatever pains it costs, break the will if you would not damn the child. Let a child from a year old be taught to fear the rod and cry softly. From that age, make him to do as he is bid. If you whip him 10 times running to effect it, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. You can see where that came from. If you do not conquer, you ruin him. Break his will now, and his soul shall live, and he will probably bless you to all eternity. And at another time he said, this is John Wesley again, talking about children, they are more foolish and more wicked than they can possibly conceive. The desire of the eyes must not be fed by pretty playthings, glittering toys, red shoes, necklaces, or ruffles. So you can get a feel for the view that was around. Now this sounds pretty tough. In fact, you may remember a little bit later, but Charles Dickens writing stories about the schooling and the education that was sort of the result of this movement. It was harsh. The discipline was tough. It seems nasty. For us today, it seems that way. But think of it relative to the way things were before this Sunday school movement hit. It was still, nevertheless, an improvement over the previous deplorable conditions. Because mainly, kids were now of concern. The people had to do something for them, and they were getting an education, getting some kind of training. In addition, there was an increasing middle class. And with this increasing middle class, there was a lower mortality rate, there was more leisure time, and therefore more schooling was possible. For the first time, they had the luxury, if you will, of paying attention to the concerns of children. In this same time period, though, in America, things were more optimistic. When America began, people came here, the colonists first came here, and they thought of this place as a future utopia. In fact, they called it the New Jerusalem. And in calling it the New Jerusalem, they saw children as the hope of the future. Children could make something of themselves. They had potential. This is the way that they would achieve some form of utopia that was not possible before. And because of this, they paid a lot of attention to education and to children. The educational reforms, pediatric medicine, were stronger here, developed faster than they did in Europe for these reasons. However, even in America, they still had the view, the pervading view, that children were born evil in original sin, that morality was important in training, and this is what needed to be done. There are examples in the United States, or in early America, I should say, when parents thought they were getting too close to their children. They just were too attached to them. They loved them so much, and they were worried about what negative effect this would have on the outcome for their children. So they would arrange to trade children with neighbors. And in trading children, they were then left to be able to be harsher and stricter in their discipline, and could expect this for their children as well. So this is an interesting change. We've gone now from no interest in children, and certainly no interest in child study, no systematic study or putting together of a theory of child development, to an interest, a concern in children, but children viewed as being born evil. Their basic human nature is evil, and they need to be redeemed. What would come next? What would be the next step? Well, in fact, we're going to talk about that later in terms of the next step. Children were then seen later as, what would you expect? Going from being born evil to maybe being born neutral and not being evil. And the step after that was children going from being born neutral to being born good, having many positive, good qualities. And these are the effects that came about by philosophers and people who then built on what had already been to change the view of children even further. The main philosophers that had this influence on children were two: John Locke in England and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Switzerland. These two philosophers overlapped in their time period of the period we've already talked about, but this movement was already mounting and starting. John Locke in England rebelled against the pervading view of children being preformed in some way, and took on a view that in fact they came into the world neutral and without any kind of preformation, whether it be evil or good. He had the view that children were born neutral. He coined the phrase, children are born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, upon which the environment writes and creates the person. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, went further to say that children are born with tendencies to be good and perfect, and left to their own devices will develop into very good, accomplished, optimal people. And it's only society that then corrupts them when society gets in the way. And in our next lecture, we're going to talk more about the work of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these philosophers that changed the view. And we're going to talk about how their work is related to two major approaches or worldviews about human nature and child study. One is the mechanistic view, and one is the organismic view. Thank you. Hello, In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of the history, the early history of child study. If you recall, in the last lecture, we began by talking about the history of child study, or the history of concern for children, as it started in the pre-industrial and industrial revolution in Europe and in America. We talked about 6 phases in this study. Let me review these for you. The first phase was a phase of no concern, a phase where children, in fact, were barely tolerated. And then came a phase where children were seen, there was a concern for children, and children were seen as being born evil in need of redemption. The third phase that we're going to talk about today is the pre-empirical phase, in which major philosophers had an influence on people's views of children. The fourth phase is a phase of observational research. The fifth phase is a phase where theoretical science developed and reigned. And the sixth phase is the phase of today of contemporary diversity. And as I mentioned then, in today's lecture, we're going to talk primarily about phase 3. In this phase of our history of child study, we see some philosophers take a strong role in influencing the views that people had of human nature and of children. Now, this phase in reality began in the 17th century, and it really overlapped with the changes that we've already discussed. These phases were not lockstep in a chronological order. Nevertheless, this influence began with some very well-educated people who, during the Enlightenment, eventually had philosophical ideas and influenced their friends, and eventually this influence spread till the pervading influence of the masses of people in the population. Today, very few of us read these philosophies and some of their works, but their ideas are still with us. They have become part of our thinking. They have become part of Western culture. There were 2 major philosophers that we're going to talk about that changed these prevailing concepts. They had philosophies of human nature that have since been associated with 2 major and conflicting worldviews. I have to explain what I mean by a worldview. A worldview is beyond a specific theory. A worldview is a pervading way that a person has of looking at reality. It's beyond empirical testing or proof. We can't prove or disprove a worldview, an approach. It's this general approach, this value or belief system that someone has. And in terms of how we look at human nature, people do have pervading worldviews. These worldviews then can lead to specific theories. And there are often many different theories who are not the theories that don't always agree with each other, that still fall under the rubric of one particular worldview or another worldview. People argue, though, that if theorists and people have the same worldview, we would expect that they would have an easier time integrating their theories, finding commonalities. If the worldviews are diametrically opposed to each other, there may be a lot more difficulty speaking to each other, coming to terms. Now, scientific theories should be disprovable. They're based on empirical evidence. They're meant, as we've said before, to explain empirical evidence, to unify facts. Worldviews are beyond this, but we still have them, and we have to take account of them. The 2 worldviews that we'll consider, not the only worldviews, but 2 major worldviews, and these views are what are called the mechanistic approach and the organismic approach. And I will explain what I mean by the mechanistic and the organismic approach. But let me first go back to the 2 philosophers that we're going to talk about, and then show how they get into these worldviews. The first philosopher was John Locke. He was born in 1632. He died in 1714. He was an English academic, and he was a doctor. Now, he's very well known for writing about different subjects, including politics and the way society works, and he was one of the primary founders of a philosophy called English empiricist philosophy that had a great deal of influence also in America. I'm going to come back to a little bit to what I mean by this empiricist philosophy. But in addition to everything else that Locke did, in 1690, he published an essay that is in fact entitled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And then shortly after that, he published a book entitled Some Thoughts Concerning Education. These two publications eventually revolutionized the thinking of many people about how humans develop and how they learn. Locke was called an empiricist because, in his view, all that we become, everything that we are, results from our experiences with the environment. He challenged the pervading view that humans come into the world with many preformed notions and skills. Immanuel Kant had that view, that we're sort of preformed. Certainly, he challenged the view that we're born evil. That was a preformed view. But for Locke, the supreme empiricist, everything we know has to come from our sensory input, from what we can observe, what we can take in. And that's also what we become. What does that leave us with as our human nature? What are we as a species? Well, Locke coined the phrase, children are born a tabula rasa, a blank slate. He meant by that metaphor that children are a blank slate that society and the environment then write upon. In his view, a child can develop any skill or any personality depending on how the world, how other people, how the society influences that child. So interestingly, we're born here having potential to become anything because we're nothing at birth. And interestingly for Locke, he could take any given child, assuming the child has basically normal neurological functioning and isn't highly damaged. He could take any child, and he expected that he could do this, and turn that child into some evil person, some criminal, some scholar, some philanthropist, and do what he wanted. Now, of course, if you take this view, you start focusing on the environment. The environment is extremely important. Locke didn't believe that we had no biology and that we didn't have certain ways that we developed. Of course, he wasn't stupid, but the environment became supremely important. Now, as we mentioned in the last lecture, remember, people had been progressing from having no concern for children to perceiving them as being born evil. And Locke took this this progression one step further. They're born neutral and society molds them. That's the point I want to make. Locke's view that he held here became known and associated with what's called then the mechanistic approach, this worldview. He was not the first to hold this view. For example, René Descartes had a mechanistic approach. But Locke applied it specifically to child development and the processes of child development. It became his model and a model that others have followed. In the basic model of the mechanistic approach to humans, this worldview, the metaphor is humans are seen as machines. That's why it's called mechanistic. Now, when people started back in old days, they thought of a clock as maybe their prototypical machine. I find it helpful to think of a car as the prototypical machine. But most people today that take a mechanistic view think of computers as their prototypical model for how humans are. Computer is the model for human, or a car, or a clock. Now, in some ways, of course, we are like machines. In many ways, in fact. But in some ways, we're not. That's the screwy thing about these worldviews. You can't ever say it's one thing or another. It's a little of both. But the idea is this metaphor of human as machine is used to describe human nature. This is the focus. One of the aspects is that as a machine, we have interchangeable parts. We have components. This is true. My mother just had knee replacements. And in fact, I think of a lot of the medical procedures today, and it seems like we have a body that's essentially interchangeable parts. We replace hearts, we replace organs, We fix things. We put joints together. Medicine even looks at the body and figures out very clever ways of fixing things that seem to act and function as if we're a machine. So in many ways we are. I used to say, from the brain on down, we're a machine. I actually think nowadays the brain is a machine. The brain's the computer. The rest of us seems to function like a robot, in a sense, with joints and such. Okay, let me give you some important characteristics of this mechanistic approach. And see, when you hear these, see if this makes sense to you, if this resonates with you, if this feels like an approach that you would take. Most importantly, for this model of humans, is humans are seen as passive organisms. I mentioned once before, when I say passive, I don't mean that they don't get up and move around and walk and run. But they're reactionary organisms, just like machines. Like machines, humans are inherently at rest. They're stable. They react only to stimuli from outside themselves. Now, in fact, if you use my dog as the model instead of humans, I would have to take a mechanistic approach. I, by the way, have a basset hound, so if you know basset hounds, this makes sense. He basically sleeps all day, and the only time he seems to get up is when he smells food, or when he hears his name, or some such stimulation from outside that turns him on and makes him respond. But are humans like this? Think about it, and you decide. And a second point about this mechanistic approach, like a machine, and I just mentioned this with a dog, something from outside has to turn them on. You see, in a mechanistic approach, the environment plays a primary role. And therefore, stimulation comes in through our senses. We learn about things because of the stimulation coming in and turning us on. You can see where John Locke's view of a blank slate for humans fits into this model. We're nothing except for the potential to become anything. And then the outside switches the switch, turns us on, we react to it, we take it in. Now this leads to another point, another characteristic of the mechanistic approach. And that is, in order to know something or to learn something, we acquire a copy of reality. In other words, we internalize facts and data and information from the outside world. We react to what's being presented to us. The real world is out there. It's real and it's out there. And we have to sense it. And we have to learn about it. So as an example, people with a mechanistic approach, when they talk about how humans learn to use symbols, how children, in fact, learn to use symbols, they talk about symbols as being one thing that's a copy of something else, or a model, or stands for something else. Usually that something else is called a referent. So there's a symbol that's a copy for a referent. And what we do when we learn symbols is we simply learn the connections between these things. Symbols are presented to us. We use one as a copy for something else. There's another sense of symbol development, and that is one that came from the approach that I'm going to get into in a minute, the organismic approach, and was stressed by Piaget, who we'll talk about later. And that is that we create the symbols. We construct the symbols. They're not copies in any sense. We create our own symbols and our own reality. We just don't make copies of the world. Now, like machines, humans are seen as an organization of component parts. So in order to understand humans, we need to break them down into the component parts, much as you would break down a car or a computer. If you need to fix somebody, if something's broken, you fix the parts. So if your car isn't working, you get in, you replace the brake liners, you fix the carburetor, you tune up different parts, and now it's working fine. And you do the same thing with humans. I just said, in many ways we do that with our bodies. But in a psychological sense, you do it also with our learning, with our psychology. The stress is on the different components of learning, the different aspects. This has become then a reductionist model of humans. By a reductionist model, I mean that all of the problems and issues are broken down into, or reduced, if you will, to component parts. And we look at the parts separately. There is something called an information processing model of how we think. This model is based on a computer as the example. And when you see examples of how theorists have used this information processing model, it looks like a flow chart for computers. For example, they explain memory as some sensory input comes in through some mechanism we have, like our vision, is stored in a temporary storage facility in our mind, in a short-term memory store, long enough for some other process to pick it up and go to other memory stores and pick up information to see what it should be related to and where it should be then filed. And other decisions, other pieces of information are brought in to make decisions on what you do with this piece of information. Very often, reaction time is the measure they use to figure out what the process is. If something takes longer, it must have gone through these memory stores than if it took a shorter time and went through these memory stores. This way of looking at problem solving and looking at memory in humans is certainly mechanistic, because it's like we have these little component parts and the information is going through the system and we see which parts are causing which problem. For example, in memory, if we can't remember something, is it because it never got in the first place to our short-term memory? Is it because once it got into long-term memory, it decayed and everything fell apart there? Is it because our retrieval part isn't available to bring it out of long-term memory to do something with it? All the parts are there. You see that? It's handy. It's a pretty good model for explaining memory, but it's a mechanistic approach. Just want to point that out. Okay, another component, another aspect of the mechanistic approach is that the focus is on individual differences in human development. It's how the world makes us into diverse individuals and what environmental manipulations work best to bring about a particular type of development. You see, if we're focusing on individual parts and we're focusing on environmental manipulations, we're paying attention to individual differences. Which things cause this to happen and you develop this way, and which things cause this to happen and you develop this way. So think about it. Is that the approach, the worldview you have about humans? Don't be misled by thinking, oh, I couldn't think of humans as just machines. Machines are only the metaphor, the model for how humans function. Now, let's return to our philosophers. If Locke changed our view to children being born neutral, then the second major philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, changed the view still further. What's left? He saw children as being born good, but they were corrupted by society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Swiss philosopher. He was born in 1712 and died in 1778. He came to espouse a view that was really in contradiction to Locke's view. Now, from what I've read about Rousseau, I think he was a rebel-rouser of his time. Probably if he were around today, we would think of him as a cantankerous guy who caused a lot of trouble and seemed to enjoy that. Okay. He talked a lot about society also and about different issues. He didn't really seem to be much of an expert on children. There isn't a lot of indication that he knew them very well. That could be dangerous if you're giving us views on child development. But in 1762, he published a novel, a supposed novel, called Emile. And in that novel, it was really a vehicle for him to lay out his view of human nature and of child development. He said, the natural state of humans at birth is that they're good. They have inborn capacities that allow them to develop along an optimal path and to become valuable and good adults. They already have it in them that they're going to develop. And in fact, there are many people today, I sort of see this in kids, that kids seem to have this self-righting mechanism, that there's a tendency to be healthy, to want to survive, to develop optimally, to make it. And Rousseau focused on that aspect. However, in his view, society and society's agents, that is, parents and educators and religious leaders, because he did not like those religious leaders that we talked about previously, these people usually channel and corrupt this natural developmental path. And they cause problems in the children we see. So society and their agents are the culprits. So Rousseau believed that the correct obligation of society and parents was to clear out the obstacles so that children could develop at their own rate, in their own way, without the biases and the evils of the society being thrust upon them. Society was there, but the ideal was for parents or society to just make sure none of these obstacles, these biases from the past would stand in the way of a kid being able to just follow his natural developmental course and make it. Now, the paradox for Rousseau is that he thought society corrupts, but he also thought society was needed to channel the way, to make changes. There's nothing in his writing that shows that Rousseau thought we should be noble savages and just be left to nature to run around naked and develop as we pleased. He thought society was there and we ought to do something with it. It was somewhat of a paradox that he thought society was so evil, and yet it was necessary. Let me give you two quotes by Rousseau to show his way of thinking. This first one, he's talking about how you teach and help and rear a child. And he says, the mind should be left undisturbed till its faculties have developed. In other words, isn't that interesting? Lay off. And here's his second quote. And this he's talking to somebody, if you will, and giving this person advice on the person's child, the person's student, maybe an educator. He says, O wise man, take time to observe nature. Watch your scholar well before you say a word to him. First, leave the germ of his character free to show itself. Do not constrain him in anything, the better to see him as he really is. So do you get that sense of where Rousseau was coming from? He really wouldn't take the view that children are miniature adults. Not at all. They're not blank slates, they're not miniature adults. He had the view that children were perfect organisms. That is, perfectly well adapted to the requirements of each given age or stage of life. In a sense, babies were perfect to do what babies are supposed to do. And preschoolers are perfect to be what preschoolers are supposed to be, as are adolescents and so on. He then, because of this view, his focus went to qualitative shifts in development. So it was from Rousseau that a strong influence came to many theorists later on, that they looked for stages of development, if you will, for qualitative reorganizations or shifts. Now, let me give you a sort of a funny example. Picture in your mind a baby that now grows up to become an adult, and so is my size, but stays exactly in the same organization and proportions of a baby. What would that person look like? We would have a freak on our hands. We would have this person standing next to me with a head that maybe is down to here, and these little scrawny bowed legs. You know, if you just made a baby bigger, he would look very strange, as would be the case if you made a preschooler bigger. So even in growth, even in just physically maturing, we have qualitative shifts. We change. And it isn't that the baby is imperfect. The baby is perfect for being a baby, but not the same as an adult. There's no such thing as a miniature adult. Okay. Rousseau's philosophy represents a second major worldview, and this is the organismic approach, as I mentioned. I'm going to take you through the organismic approach in the same parallel way I went through the mechanistic approach by comparison. So the basic prototype or model for the organismic approach is humans are organisms. Well, of course we're organisms. That goes without saying. But the idea, the model for the organismic approach is that it's the whole organism that's the basic model. The entire organism as it functions. So let me talk about these key characteristics. Rather than viewing humans as machines with different component parts, the organismic approach sees humans as having one system. And rather than seeing humans as being passive and reactionary, humans are seen as active, initiating organisms. We are inherently active and changing, not at rest. Our basic state is change, not rest. We initiate our own actions. We initiate change and growth. We seek it out. And in fact, in the idea of an organismic approach, to have nothing happening is not good, this stability. Boredom will kill you, and we become highly bored. If everything is right, if we have all our needs met, we're well fed, we're well rested, we're the right temperature, we're not sick, we want action. We don't want to just sit back and do nothing and shut down. And this approach, this part of humans comes from this organismic approach. With this active view, we seek out change then, and guess what? It leads to a focus on internal influences, biological, but more than biological, on influences that are part of our nature, that this is the way we're built as a species. We seek out these things. In order to know something, remember I said in the mechanistic approach, you have a copy of reality out there and you take it in. In the organismic approach, you actively construct what is known. Rather than simply taking in copies like a sponge, we create our own reality. To return to this example of symbol formation, we create connections between symbols. We create the world that we see. And so, when you get further down to theorists that came from this approach, like Piaget, he argues that in our mind is the reality that we create. It may or may not be what somebody else creates. And it's very difficult to say whether it really matches reality because we've constructed our own mind and our own thinking. And rather than studying humans as in terms of their component parts, the entire system or the structural whole is the focus. In the organismic approach, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Once you start looking at component parts, you miss something. Let me give you some examples. Even in medicine, even in dealing with the body, very often if you give medicine for one problem, you throw off the system and something else fails. To give medicine, you have to consider everything that's happening and all the medicines that are happening and the whole system. In the treatment of infantile diabetes, people have learned you just can't treat the medical situation and give the medication. To be successful, at least with little kids, you have to give them a kind of therapy to help them to deal with what they're facing. This lifelong problem that they need to deal with and work on and treat. And you need to teach them how to deal with it, how to live with it, and how to handle it. It's the entire system that's important. The focus is on universals, norms in development. Not all individuals are different. Of course they are. But the focus is on how we're the same, not how we're different. Related to Rousseau's view of this noble child, people with an organismic approach focus on figuring out what is typical, what is the average or normal way that people develop, rather than focusing on the environmental interventions that will cause us to change. After all, we're all alike, but we're also all different. Now, these influences stay with us today. And these philosophies stay with us. Whether you read them or not, Locke's view has influenced behaviorist theories, it's influenced computer models, and it's influenced Bandura's theory that we're going to talk about in the future. Rousseau's view and the organismic approach has influenced Piaget's theory and a lot of theories related to education, including Pestalozzi's, Froebel, who developed the kindergarten movement, even John Dewey in this country, and certainly Maria Montessori's approach to open education, to active learning. And so in the next lecture, we're going to continue by talking about how these differences then carried over to a study of children in a very systematic way, the beginning of science. Thank you. Hello. In this lecture, we're going to conclude our romp through the history of child study, the history of how we got to the point where grand theorists developed their ideas about human development. To review for you once again, I talked about 6 phases of this history. The first phase was a phase in which children were not of concern and there was no interest in child study. The second phase was a phase in which children were seen as born evil, needing redemption. In the third phase, major philosophers, Locke and Rousseau, developed the idea that humans were born neutral and then that humans were born good. And in this phase today, we're going to talk about observational research, and also in the fifth phase about how theoretical science then developed, and then in the sixth and last phase about contemporary diversity, the way we have the field of human development today. After the influence of the philosophers that we discussed in the last lecture, we had a burgeoning interest in science and the study of humans and child development in particular from a scientific viewpoint. You see, science was emerging as a way of gaining knowledge about the world. Before that, philosophers had dominated. They had great ideas, and it wasn't to say that they weren't empirical. Philosophers did observe nature and did observe the way things were to develop their philosophies and their theories. But scientists espoused the view that everything we knew had to be empirical, that how we gain knowledge was through observable, objective data. And these observable, objective data were necessary to establish the validity of any philosophical idea or any hypothesis. When I say objective data, that meant in science that not only could one scientist observe what was happening, but another scientist could also observe that same information. And one scientist could describe what he or she observed and pass it on to another scientist. So in this way, there was reliability. People could verify what each other was saying. This empirical approach to knowledge really took over in many fields, and it also influenced the newly burgeoning field of psychology, which was a very young and new science that had developed out of philosophy. And it also influenced the study of human development as well. Why didn't it develop earlier? Why wasn't there this systematic study of children earlier? Well, science was not the main process or method of discovering information. We also didn't have the luxury of time and a middle class and resources to spend studying children. And I also think that those previous philosophies and ideas that we talked about of looking at children as being at least neutral, if not having a lot of good qualities, and being distinct from adults, having some developmental course, those views were necessary for people to now then take a view that let's study in a systematic way what children are all about. Let's really learn what's happening to them. So some scientists began publishing detailed, systematic accounts of the development of their own children, Now, these forerunners of developmental psychologists are sometimes called the baby biographers. And the first known published account was in 1787. It was a diary of the observations of Dietrich Tiedemann in Germany. It's interesting. You think 1787, for thousands of years, possibly millions of years, people have been observing their children. Well, maybe somebody did write something down and systematically observe them. This is the first account that we have. But remember, in the past, at least in European history and American history, as I already mentioned, there wasn't this interest in the systematic study and observation. Dietrich Tiedemann then wrote a detailed diary explaining normal development as he saw it in his own child. In 1882, Wilhelm Preyer in Germany published what we call now the first textbook on child development. But it was written in the same manner, detailed descriptive observations of his child and other children. There were other detailed observations by people of their own children, again, part of this baby biographer movement or approach. Alfred Binet, who's famous as being the founder, the father of the intelligence test, was one of the people who wrote a baby biography of his own child. And Alfred Binet proved to be a very astute observer of child development and many issues in development. We're going to come back to Binet in a little bit. The most famous baby biographer was Jean Piaget, well past this time, in modern times, but he followed the same approach. For part of his theory, he did detailed observations of his own 3 children over a period of about 3 years and wrote detailed notes that falls under this category of a baby biography. He used this as some of his most important information to back up his theoretical accounts. Charles Darwin first published, of course, everybody knows he was famous. He first published The Origin of Species. But later, after this publication, in 1877, he published detailed observations of his own son. Charles Darwin was a superb observer. I've read parts of this observation, and it astounds me how modern and up-to-date Darwin was in his observations of his own son. He discussed the development of emotions, of causal thinking, of the concept of self, and other domains of development that we're still attempting to unravel and understand today. He said things that could be written in a fairly modern day about these things. He was a good observer. My guess is, if Darwin hadn't focused on evolution, he could have been famous as one of the first developmental psychologists. Now, each parent in these baby biographies had access to more detailed observations than anyone else. If you have your child, your subject, with you day in and day out, and you know that child very well, you have the ability now to really make detailed and astute observations. That was the good thing about the baby biographers. But each baby biographer also reflected the biases of his own theory and his own concepts of a child's nature, just as we have already talked about the different approaches or views of a child's nature. Darwin's child, surprise, surprise, supported his views of evolution and adaptation. Piaget's children, surprise, surprise, supported his theory of cognitive development. They fit in perfectly, and that was the case with every one of these baby biographers. But I think this was the impetus to start more research, more empirical observation of children. Following this work, empirical scientists functioned like naturalists, and they began to do systematic observations of children and of their development. Now, for a modern counterpart, think of Jane Goodall and her work with chimpanzees in the wild. Here were these observers out stalking the wild child on the playground, in the home, in playgroups, watching what they did, keeping detailed notes, and making observations and comments about the description of development, the description in terms of what happened and the sequence that things were developing in. These scientists described normal development, but they became ever more experimental in their approaches. They started out being unobtrusive observers and started manipulating and getting more into an experimental approach to it. But for the most part, in this era, they were describers of development. They were naturalists. Some of the most influential one is G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall, I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He's an interesting character. He's both famous and not famous. He seemed to be a very bright guy. He got in early on the new field of psychology, And in that way, he was extremely influential in this new field because he was one of the first. He studied everything. He seemed to have his hand in everything and be interested in everything. He was the person who primarily founded the American Psychological Association. He was the person who primarily founded Clark University in Massachusetts. He became its first president. He studied anything and everything. He wrote hundreds of articles about child development and adolescent development in particular. And he studied things from the way girls play with different dolls and the details of the kinds of dolls they like and the sequence that they go through, the way children play, the way they interact in groups. It went on and on. And yet, even though he had an extremely strong influence on the field of psychology because of starting the institutions like the American Psychological Association, nobody reads his stuff today. Hundreds of articles, they haven't gone anywhere. Let me go back to our very first lecture, and I mentioned if we don't have a theory to unify facts and data, we can't do anything with these things. They don't stick in our mind. We can't put it together. Theories help explain things and simplify the world and put things together. And a theory was not what Hall had, not at least in terms of explaining all of his massive observations. He was a data gatherer. But because nothing held together, because he couldn't put it all together, he didn't have much of an influence from all of his empirical work. That's a caution to you would-be future developmental researchers. Alfred Binet was another one who was an early observational researcher of children. Now, Alfred Binet is also famous, as most of you know, as the father of intelligence testing. I already mentioned that. He was famous in particular because of developing this intelligence test. He worked in Paris, and in fact, the first intelligence tests that he developed were for a very compassionate reason. The people there wanted some kind of assessment of kids who would have problems in the school systems. They were having too many problems, they weren't fitting in, and they thought if we could just get a handle on those that might be at risk, at high risk, and need extra help, we could do something to help them along. If we knew that beforehand. And they went to Binet, who was studying child development and seemed to be an expert, and they said, would you develop some kind of assessment tool that can help us to do this? And he thought, well, the best thing to do is figure out the kinds of skills that a kid needs to make it through the typical school system, those tasks, and let's assess those tasks before he gets there to see what tendencies he has, predispositions he has, if he's ready for it. Sort of like Head Start, to see if he's ready. And that's the kind of things he did with his tests. Then he standardized these tests. After giving the test to many kids, throwing out questions, adding questions, he came up with some standard tests that showed if you're this age, this is what kids typically can answer, here's what they can't answer. And he had the test divided into different domains or categories, how you do in spatial skills, how you do in vocabulary, how you do in this area or that area. It only later became known as, quote, a test of intelligence. But it started out as a test to assess which kids would have problems in school so you could assess the kinds of problems they'd have, which ones would do okay. It does a very good job at that particular task. That was what Binet mainly did. But most people don't know this. He also did a lot of detailed observations of kids. And in his work with those, with the kids, he was also an astute observer. He gathered data from different areas, he began to theorize, and he made a lot of sense of what he found. Interestingly, Binet gave up all of his developmental work and later became a playwright in Paris, and at least the reports are that he was fairly successful. This ends this phase. Now remember, in real life it didn't end so artificially. But the fifth phase in our history of child study was a shift to more theoretical science. What the scientists of child development had been doing was contributing systematic information of data. They had been describing development, if you will. And now scientists began to change to not just describing the child, but to explaining the processes. So the scientists began to develop systematic theories to account for the sequences of development that they saw in children and the underlying mechanisms or processes that would explain this development. So the grand theorists began to emerge. John B. Watson at Johns Hopkins University was one of the most influential and famous of these grand theorists. In the 1920s, he took the earlier work of Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov in Russia, who had done work on conditioning in animals. And he developed this work in applying it to babies and to humans. And he developed a theory that was called behaviorism. And it came to dominate American psychology. It also dominated all of the theoretical approaches to child development in this country. Many people ask me if I'm related to John Watson. And I tell them, yes, my grandfather was John Watson, but not the John Watson. He was called the father of behaviorism. And if you look at this approach, it really comes back, it harkens right back to John Locke's approach to development and to human nature, that we're born neutral and we're molded by the environment. It looks to the future, John Watson's future, that is, in which he influenced B.F. Skinner, one of the most famous behaviorists, and eventually Albert Bandura, who is one of the theorists that we are going to talk about. Behaviorist theory stressed the influence of the environment on the child. The child was a blank slate, once again, and could be made into anything one wanted. In fact, John Watson's view of molding children put John Locke to shame. John Watson had, and I'm paraphrasing, but a quote that went something like this. He said, if you give me any 10 children who are neurologically normal, and if you'll give me absolute control of their world and their upbringing and their environment, I'll make them anything you want at random. I'll make one into a thief, the other one into President of the United States, one into a musician, one into a philanthropist, and one into a drunk. I can do it all. I can mold them into anything you want if you'll just give me the control of their environment. That's an extreme view. It also changed psychology, this approach that he had. Because after the behaviorist revolution brought about by Watson, psychology now became the study of observable behavior rather than the study of intellectual and psychological processes, which it to a large extent had been. And that's because Watson stressed, if we're going to be scientists, we have to pay attention to what we can observe accurately and objectively. And that's only behavior. We'll never know what somebody's thinking, what's going on inside. We'll look at what comes in from the environment and how that relates to the behaviors or responses that people give. He always called them responses. Remember, we had a mechanistic view here that people responded to outside influences. In fact, I think it was just a hype, but in selling his theory, Watson once said, there isn't such a thing as mind. It doesn't exist. I don't think he believed that, but he wanted to stress this is not what we're about. Now, his work had such a strong influence on psychology that after a while dominated in America and drove all other work out. One of the other competing theories at the time, about that same time period, was the work of Arnold Gesell. Arnold Gesell was at Yale University, and he developed a stage theory of normative behavior that was based on maturational processes. Rather than the extreme mechanistic approach of Watson's environmental approach, Gesell had an extremely organismic approach that was not looking at the environment as being influential, but was really looking at this unfolding, this automatic unfolding in maturation of kids going through sequences. He was a very good observer. He wrote a lot about this and had an influence, but most of his work is not used today. I personally think that Watson's behaviorism drove out a lot of competing theories, and that's one reason they haven't been so influential today. But one thing we have left over from Gesell's work, we have this sense of stages, and we have phrases in our vocabulary that came from his work. We say, oh, that kid is just going through a stage. That came from Gazel's work. Or the terrible twos. That's from Gazel's work. During this same time period, in Europe, a supreme theorist was developing a theory that was the most extensive and far-reaching theory that had yet been developed, and that was Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud's theory was revolutionizing thinking about children. Most of us know something about Freud's theory. We've been exposed to it. He's part of our culture. He's part of our thinking. He wasn't developing a theory that was primarily to explain, the primary purpose was to explain child development. He was an analyst. He was a physician. He was trying to explain psychopathology and disorders. But to try to make this grand explanation of everything, he was paying attention to development as well. His theory has become known as a psychodynamic theory or a psychoanalytic theory. Psychodynamic because it was dynamic, moving, changing. There were a lot of things going on. Psychoanalytic because he was also stressing the therapy side of it, the way therapy was done. And he stressed the importance and strong influence of unconscious processes and conflicts that go on within a person, and the way we develop our personality. Now, we're going to come back to Freud's theory later and explain that theory in more detail. But when Freud's theory made it to America and began influencing American developmental psychologists and other developmental researchers, it was in direct competition to Watson's behaviorist theory. And the two were competing and duked it out for some time. Now, this was expected, since behaviorism really stemmed from a mechanistic approach, was probably the most extreme of mechanistic approaches. And the psychodynamic theory stemmed from an organismic approach. So behaviorism and psychoanalysis were always fighting. They were around at the same time, primarily in the 30s and the 40s. In some cases, people tried to reconcile the two. They would write about how psychodynamic or Freudian principles could be really thought of in terms of a behaviorist approach. But for the most part, they were at disagreement with each other. Behaviorism eventually won out in its influence on science and research. And when behaviorism won out, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory didn't have much influence on research, at least in this country. And behaviorism did, and generated massive reams of research and the approach we took. Behaviorism was a theory that didn't look at stages so much, or at the strong differences and unfolding of children's development. It looked at processes, and it really compared learning to development and basically took the view that they were one and the same things. The last grand theorist of child development also revolutionized European thinking before influencing American scientists, and this was Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development. Piaget's theory was the most all-encompassing and systematic theory of human development that had ever emerged. In fact, the most comprehensive and all-encompassing theory that has ever emerged in the field of human development. He was primarily interested in child development, but his end goal was to explain how the child got to be the adult, how we come to be able to think and process as we do. So for Piaget, he took a sidetrack to study children that lasted his entire life, but he was interested in human nature and in human development across the whole lifespan. He just happened to study child development and the origins as the way to explain it. And in Piaget's theory, we have the absolute embodiment of the organismic approach. He clearly was strongly influenced by Rousseau's work and by that organismic way of thinking. And he incorporated that in every way into his theory. When he was then translated into English and started to have an influence in the United States, behaviorism was very strong. and was basically controlling everything in the field. But gradually, Piaget's work started to influence people. At first, American psychologists and other people studying development fought it, tooth and claw, but eventually it won out. And so in the 1970s and the 1980s, it completely dominated research and thinking in the field of development and throughout the world. And it eliminated behaviorism as the dominant form, just as behaviorism had eliminated Freudian theory as the dominant form and theory. Now the sixth and last phase in our history of child study can be called the phase of contemporary diversity. Previous theories, particularly those of Freud and Piaget, are still with us today, implicitly in our thinking. Even if you have never read Freud in the original or had a course on Freud, all of you have certain ideas from Freud that are part of our thinking. And certainly anybody who studies child development and human development has implicitly ideas and an understanding that comes from Piaget. And likewise, we all have certain behaviorist ideas that are still with us today. But today, we still have theorists. This is the era of scientific theorizing on development, just as it is in other domains. But no one theory dominates the field of child study or of human development study as it once did. The study of child development and human development more generally has become so diverse that each domain of development seems to have theories that lead to research in that domain alone, but do not address issues in other domains. It is this way, I think, with all of science. As we gain more information, as more people study it, the sciences break up and diversify. Where at first maybe you had one general physical science, it broke up into chemistry and physics, and eventually biology. And then we broke into biochemistry, and we have nuclear physics and theoretical physics and different kinds of physics. And we have molecular biology that's separate from the naturalists. Well, in psychology, the same thing has happened. It's hard to talk about psychology being one unified domain or one unified field today. And it's also true for the study of human development, even child development. So today, we have some strong research and theorizing in areas of cognitive development, left over from Piaget's influence, in language development, in children's understanding of other people's thinking. That is, their ability to make attributions and understand how the mind works and how we make sense of what other people might do and think. We have a strong area of neurological development because right now the strongest area of research is neuroscience. And we have a strong area of developmental disorders and psychopathology. We also have a very strong area now of development across the entire lifespan, especially looking at development in old age. However, there haven't been any major theories of the intensity that these 6 theories that we're discussing in this course have reached that explain development in adulthood and old age. But this is probably an area that's ripe for grand theorizing and taking over. It's hard to predict the future, but probably some new theories will come about from some of these areas. What's difficult to say is whether any theory will take over the entire field, the way Piaget's did or the way Freud's did, or whether we're beyond that now in the field. The 6 theories that we're going to study in the future lectures were built on these early influences on child study. Though these theories don't dominate the entire field today, they still have a strong influence, every one of them. And they influence our conceptions of children and human nature. Now this is interesting. Many of the most influential theorists, many from this group that we're going to study for the rest of this course, came from outside the field of human development. That seems interesting to me and sort of strange. Freud really came from medicine. He was a physician. Erikson, as you'll learn, really had no formal academic training, but he was a psychotherapist and came to development from that way. John Bowlby was a psychotherapist and then came to development from there. Piaget was a philosopher and a biologist. Vygotsky was, it's hard to say what the field was. He was trained as a lawyer. He was a philosopher and came to it that way. Why is that? I think that's interesting because if we want to have great theorists coming along, it seems like we should train them in the field of child and human development. But in some ways, you might argue that if you train them in this way, maybe you stifle them and their creativity. In some ways, the theorists who came along had creativity and were able to break new ground because they brought a different approach or came with a fresh approach to things. Next lecture, we begin by studying Sigmund Freud's theory. Thank you. Hello. In the last few lectures, we covered the early history of the development of child study and our sense of how children develop, the conceptions of children. In this lecture today, and for the next two lectures, we're going to talk about Freud's theory. Freud is the first theorist then that we'll cover in detail. And today we'll talk about his basic energy model and the drives and the way these drives meet adaptive needs of individuals. In this first developmental theory of Freud's, we talk about what's called a psychodynamic theory. Now, it's called psychodynamic because it focuses on dynamic psychological processes, mainly unconscious processes. In the sense of being dynamic, it's always moving, it's always being used. And the reason that Freud came up with this theory was to try to explain how we adapt and then constantly readapt to our environment, and also to cope with various conflicts we have. Issues that come up and conflicts that come up from within, as well as those that come from without. Now, whether one accepts Freud's theory or not, and I have to say that most psychologists today don't hold him in high regard, although there are a lot of therapists around who still use Freudian concepts and Freudian theory to guide their work. But whether you hold him in high regard or not, his concepts have become so internalized into our thinking to the point now that implicitly we have his theory with us all the time. It influences our thinking about human nature. We cannot escape Freud. It's become part of our culture and part of our thinking. And in this way, then, you have to say that Freud revolutionized the sense of human nature and certainly revolutionized psychology. When Freud first espoused his theory, it was really seen as an outrageous and actually a dangerous theory. But its influence increased over time, and despite the initial strong rejection and the disbelief of many theorists, it did have this strong revolutionary effect. You think about why it was rejected. Well, Freud came up with some pretty strong ideas, talking about infantile sexuality, about sex being the main drive, the main motivation that drove everything. Even the things he says, even today, seem a little bit touchy and outrageous today. Think of how this hit people in Victorian Vienna, a very uptight and proper society. And he was just smacking them in the face with these extreme views of things. In fact, his theory probably came about as a reaction to the extremity of that society at the time. Probably one reason for its strong influence was, though, because in spite of it being touchy and sensitive and bothering people, Freud's theory so systematically unified many aspects of human nature, and it talked about questions that we had. It talked about things that simply had not been explained or discussed before or brought into a unity of a theory. The most important point was unconscious processing. Now, people knew there was an unconscious. They talked about the unconscious. But Freud, for the first time, brought unconscious processing to the forefront of our thinking and really talked about how it might work. So ever since Freud, we can now never go back to thinking we don't have unconscious processes, and they're a major part of who we are as humans. He changed that forever. He also explained, this is an interesting aspect of what he did, he explained the current problems that a person has by systematically linking them to our past or to a person's past developmental history. So, what a revolutionary idea, that maybe the problems you have might stem from the problems you had in childhood or the problems you had with your parents. You see how common that is, how obvious that seems to us today, and it wasn't when Freud came along and brought this about. He tied a lot of aspects of human relationships together, how one relationship might relate to another kind of relationship. He explained a lot of aspects of motivation, little understood aspects of motivation. For example, we feel mixed emotions and mixed motivations. We want to do one thing, but we want to do something else. We want to really do something, but we don't do it. Why is that? And we have these mixed motivations. Usually we're not even conscious of all the motivations. We're not even conscious of all of our emotions. Those are the kinds of issues that Freud dealt with. And he described our defensiveness, when we get very defensive in dealing with or talking about some aspect. He also described neuroses. Now, the physicians of the time knew that there were neuroses, but he tried to explain them in a systematic way. He explained the functions of dreams as they had never been explained before. And in fact, despite his theory being old now in terms of the massive amount of research on sleep and dreaming, he still did a pretty good job. Even today, we talk about dreams as being ways that we work out issues or problems or go over things that we need to understand, stuff like that came from Freud. So, Freud's theory had a lot of extremely valuable and revolutionary aspects to it. In Freud's theory, he meant to focus on how the entire personality develops. He wanted to show how we adapt to reality, how we develop disorders and psychopathologies. But he also was very much interested in how we treat disorders. Remember, he was really a therapist, a physician. So there are a lot of aspects of his theory that deal with treatment, with therapy, with disorders that I'm not going to talk about in these lectures. I want to focus on some aspects of his theory that apply to child development. And those are the aspects then that are important for us. I have to go back for a minute though. Initially, when we started these lectures, I said that to understand human nature, it's important to understand the origins, where we came from and the process of how we develop. In fact, that's exactly what Freud did. He wanted to understand problems, he wanted to understand human nature, but in order to do that, he had to talk about origins, about development. He saw the necessity of talking about child development, how we got from our beginnings to where we are. He was a revolutionary thinker. Have I made that clear? But he was also a product of his times. So a lot of his thinking you can trace to the things that influenced him. Let me give you a little bit of Freud's history. He was born in 1856 in Moravia, which was then a part of Austria. He lived most of his life in Vienna. And later on, he became a refugee to Nazism. He escaped to England in 1938 with his family. And he died just a year later in 1939 in England. Being Jewish, Freud was exposed to strong anti-Semitic prejudices in Europe at that time. And it's very likely that these prejudices, in part, colored many of his views about human nature. Because Freud had somewhat of a negative view of humans. They were tough. They were trying to adapt, but it wasn't what you'd call entirely positive. And he saw a lot of that around him. He received his MD degree in 1888, despite the fact that there was prejudice against him getting it. And he became a practicing physician rather than a neurological researcher. It seems like he wanted to be a scientist, be a researcher, but the financial necessities required that he make some money, and he become a practitioner. He also seemed, from what he says, everything you can learn about him, he seemed to have this very strong motivation to have an impact on the scientific and medical community. It was biased against him. He wanted to prove himself. And this may have been one of the drives that he had. He was also influenced greatly by three areas of science as he understood them, as people understood them at that time. So first, he came from a medical background. And it was his current understanding of medicine, and with it, neurology and mental processes, that influenced the way he thought about human development and human nature. And because of this focus of the time, he was influenced by researchers and physicians who were experimenting with new types of therapy. So he got in with some people who were experimenting with hypnotism as a new way of doing therapy with people. He experimented with new drugs. We didn't have a drug culture, a medical culture that we do today. But for example, he experimented with cocaine. Thought it was a miracle drug until he learned that there were some bad side effects. He tried to understand the brain and its functioning, and he thought of himself as a neurologist in part, that he was tying his theory to neurology. However, it was a pretty lousy knowledge at the time. It was not the level we have today. I don't think people today would say it ties really well with what we currently know about neurology. And so his first area of influence was this medical community. His second major area of influence were the energy models that were current in theories and research in physics. At that time, it seems that energy was a big focus, was the issue. And he was very much taken by a hydraulic energy model. The idea is people were focusing on energy to try to explain a lot of aspects of science and of nature. And energy was seen as something that could be transformed from one type of energy into another. It could be used in different ways. When I talk about a hydraulic energy model, I mean that people saw energy in a system, almost like a boiler system or a heating system, energy that could be transferred through pipes, if you will, or through some source, from one source to another, energy that was conserved even though it was used for different purposes. And this influenced Freud, and we'll come back to that because today we are going to talk about his energy model. His third major area of influence was Darwin's theory of evolution. I think all scientists were influenced by evolution. But in particular, this concept that humans had evolved processes and functions that helped them to adapt, to survive, and reproduce was very important for Freud. You see, these processes became prominent in his conceptualization of his own theory, that we have evolved to be able to adapt and to survive. So let me go back now to this energy model, because his theory was based on an idea of energy and of drive reduction as a model. First, with energy. Freud actually believed that there was some kind of energy that ran all of our psychological processes. Now, he couldn't measure it. He didn't know where it was. But I don't think in this case, and Freud used a lot of metaphors, but in this case, I think he actually believed there was an energy system, this form of energy. It wasn't electrical, but it was some form. He called it psychic energy. Today, The word psychic has all kinds of connotations. If Freud were around today, he would have called it psychological energy. He didn't mean psychic, ESP. He meant psychological. And this psychic energy, or psychological energy, was used to run all of our processing. And he gave this energy a name. He called it the libido. Now, Freud always named everything, which makes it really easy to to hang on to his theory. It also makes it a little strange because everything starts taking sort of a personal quality, these metaphors he used. He called the energy libido. And I want to mention that because we have used the word libido so much that it has different connotations than the way Freud initially started with it. I've heard people say, that guy has a strong libido, and they mean he has a strong sex drive. But when Freud started, libido was simply the basic energy that a person needed to meet his biological needs and to deal with the challenges from the environment. And Freud believed also that individuals are born with instinctual drives. Instinctual drives that you always have with you that use this energy, or the energy is used within these drives, again, to meet your needs and to adapt. Now, in his model, a drive is activated when we have a particular need, and that need causes discomfort or irritation. It was really sort of a negative irritation model. The perfect example is hunger. You have a low blood sugar level, and this is translated neurologically into hunger pangs. You feel discomfort. And this motivates you to meet your need. You want to go out and eat to get something inside. If you eat and try to meet your need then and take action, this reduces your need and it also reduces your drive. And therefore, this kind of approach is called a drive reduction model for motivation. In fact, a lot of motivation today still uses this model, using hunger or thirst as sort of an example of how we're motivated. Motivation has gone beyond just drive reduction, but this is still around. Some of the psychic energy, or this libido, is channeled into these different drives to meet these needs, to reduce drive states. And so in this sense, the organism adapts to the demands of the environment and also to the biological demands of the organism. There are two main drives in humans, as Freud saw it. And the first of these drives he called eros. And this was a drive that was based on striving for sexual pleasure, survival, and reproduction. So as many people have said, this drive was seen as a life-affirming drive, a positive drive by Freud. And he thought that the eros, this sexual drive, pervaded most of what we're motivated to do. This was the main drive. Now, I want to mention something about sex for Freud. For Freud, sex was in everything because this was the primary drive that motivated us, where the energy was used to meet needs, to deal with conflicts and challenges. But for Freud, so much was included in sex that in some ways he sort of watered it down. So when he talks about sex and the sex drive, he doesn't just mean the sexual act as we talk about. Everything that we would call sensual or pleasure-seeking, he would call sexual. If I scratch my arm, I guess for Freud that would be sexual. If I'm hungry and I want to go get a hamburger, I guess that's sort of sexual. I'm probably putting words in his mouth. But you see, sex includes a lot of things. So when he talked about babies even babies being highly sexual beings, he didn't mean that they had adult levels of sexual conceptualizations or were even aware of adult intercourse or sexual acts. He didn't mean that. He meant that everything is sort of this sexual drive for pleasure. The second main drive, besides eros, was what he called thanatos. And this was a drive that was based on a striving for a complete static equilibrium. If the eros was life-affirming and there to gain pleasure and to survive. Thanatos was to seek absolute equilibrium, even in bodily functions. And at one point, Freud said, the ultimate equilibrium is death. Everything goes into equilibrium. And so, Freud thought we actually had a drive that led us towards our own destruction and our own death. Interestingly, Freud came up with the Thanatos drive later in his career, in his development. And it seems a lot of what he has observed in his life, suicides, the self-destructive behaviors of others, the war that was going on, the problems of the Holocaust, in part led probably to his conceptualization. But this drive is seen in self-destructive behaviors and also in aggression toward others. Now, for Freud, we can't escape these drives. They're inborn. They're always with us throughout life. We start with them as babies, and then we go on to have them later on. I'd like to give you a model for these drives, and I have to sort of paint this picture here. Picture, if you will, this big boiler pot, and it's being heated up. And inside this big iron pot is filled with a liquid that's really getting under pressure and is active and boiling away. Now, think of this boiler pot as our pot of libido, of psychic energy. And on one side of it, you have a pipe going out with a spigot. And we'll call this Eros. And you can drain off some of this psychic energy and use it for different purposes. And on the other side of the pot, you have another pipe going out and a spigot, and this is Thanatos. And you can drain off this psychic energy, this libido, and use it in that way. So, Freud used all kinds of personifications. I will too. Think of this boiler pot model then as libido with the various drives that use the energy. Because it was a hydraulic model, also keep in mind that you could change around energy. You could use it in one way and then reuse it in another way. Some of it was drained off for one purpose, some of it would be drained off for another purpose. The libido and the drives, though, have to be somewhere if you use my boiler pot model. And so Freud said they reside in the unconscious processes of the neural system. These unconscious processes Freud called, that hold the libido, Freud called the id. So we've all heard of the famous id. Now it's interesting, in the original German, it was called the es, the it. I think it's a better term than id. But the id, or the it part of us, refers to that unconscious part of the person, those basic animal functions that we're born with. The basic needs and drives to keep us alive, keep us seeking pleasure. So, for example, a baby's born. The baby has an itch and wants to scratch. It expects gratification on demand. It's unconscious. Has to scratch the itch. Baby's hungry. The baby wants to be fed, wants that irritation, if you will, that hunger taken away. So the processes of the id are basically amoral and irrational. Amoral, I didn't say immoral. The id is amoral. It doesn't care. It just has basic needs. And because all of these processes are unconscious, we're really not aware of them or how they drive us, at least most of the time, at least until Freud came along and tried to get us in touch with these unconscious processes. But we really didn't know they're just there. These processes are also so unrealistic that they really don't take count of reality or means-end relationships. When I say means-end relationships, we don't take account of what we need to do in one case to bring about some cause or some effect. The id doesn't do that. The id doesn't function that way. We can meet our needs by investing libido and bringing about certain ends, but we're not sure how we do that. So Freud said we're born with this kind of processing, and he called it primary process thinking. primary only because this is the first process that we have. In primary process thinking, which is really how the id works, we're just automatically and unconsciously trying to meet our needs. A baby is hungry, and it sucks. And very often, milk goes down, and it feels good. There's no conscious thought. There's no planning on the baby's part. The baby has an itch, it cries. The baby has a wet diaper, it feels uncomfortable, it cries. Very often, because of the help of somebody else, often, baby's needs are met. Okay? However, very often in our life, and you should know now, any adult should know this, probably a good share of the time, we don't have all our needs met. And we certainly don't have met the minute we have those needs and the minute we feel some irritation or drive. So in these cases, we still attempt to meet our needs, but if all we have is an id, an unconscious irrational process, we really don't do a very good job of meeting them. And Freud then argued that we also fantasize about meeting our needs, that we try to gain this pleasure and meet our needs and fulfill them through fantasy thinking, not in reality, but through fantasy. So when a baby's hungry, it wants to get milk, it sucks. The baby cries. If nothing happens, babysitter's not paying attention, then the baby fantasizes about sucking milk. And this fantasizing is a compensation, if you will. It compensates for not really having the need met. And Freud called this wish fulfillment. Now, I have to say that I have a criticism of Freud's theory here. He talked about babies having wish fulfillment and fantasies at a level that attributes to them a very high level of symbolic processing, of being able to keep things in the mind, to represent things in the mind. And from what we know now, what we've learned since Freud's times about kids, there isn't a lot of evidence that kids have this level of symbolic processing until it develops in the second year of life and then fully develops beyond. So in some ways, Freud really didn't seem to know babies all that well. You could say it was just a mistake of the time. He attributed a lot of you might say, sophisticated cognitive abilities to kids that we're not sure they have. For example, he said babies would dream sometimes about somebody breaking into a room. And this was really a memory of when they were in utero and their parents were having sexual intercourse, and it scared them. Well, it's hard to imagine that they really knew that was happening when they were in utero, but even if they did, how did they process that and symbolize it to keep representing it later? So he made a lot of attributions that we're not so sure about. Having said that, though, we can criticize him, but there's still some truth to this idea of wish fulfillment in some ways. Adults, especially as kids get older, or adults, if you look at adults, you can say wish fulfillment is still with us, and in Freud's terms, it's part of our unconscious. We have fantasies about, let's say, a love partner, and we dream about sex. All of these might be wish fulfillment. We're not really meeting our needs, but we have these fantasies. But these needs go unfulfilled. So the entire primary processing that's based on this idea called the pleasure principle. In Freud's view, we're trying to seek pleasure and avoid pain and discomfort. The pleasure principle is very much associated with primary processing. But it's not very adaptive because we're not going to meet our needs a lot of the time, and wish fulfillment just doesn't put milk in your belly. It doesn't really meet your needs. It's no wonder that babies wouldn't survive without their parents being around. Something else is needed. And in fact, we're going to talk about next time some of the ways that then the id further develops, or other processes break off the ego and eventually the superego, to meet the needs and be more adaptive. Before I leave, though, let me give you one case of wish fulfillment that I think really shows it working, that Freud was onto something. And this is a true story. By the way, when I tell stories, they're true. These are things that actually happen. There was a girl, a family I know, and the parents, she was a preschooler. She was about 3 at the time, 3.5. And her parents went through a separation, and they eventually got a divorce. And she did something that kids, in situations like this when the parents get a divorce, that kids very often do. In her pretend play, she sort of worked out or played at the issue that was of concern to her. And this is hard to believe, but in the same kid this happened. At one time, she pretended that she had a doll family. And the doll family was driving around in the members of the family were driving around in cars, and they were spread all over the world in her pretend play, and she couldn't get them back together. It was a very distressing, sort of negative kind of play situation. Now, if you're a Freudian, it doesn't take much work to see that she's acting out an issue or a conflict or problem that she actually had. And Freud and people that followed him said in play, as in other areas of life, we often have what's called a repetition compulsion. We have a compulsion to repeat the same negative things. It doesn't seem to make sense, but some way we're trying to work it out. We're trying to work out these issues. We're not necessarily conscious of what we're doing. She wasn't conscious of this. Later on, she pretended that the family got back together. So she went around and she gathered them up, and they all became united again as a family. In real life, this did not happen. Her parents did not get back together, but in her pretend play, they did. And Freud and others who talk about pretend play in kids talk about wish fulfillment. There's repetition compulsion, and there's wish fulfillment. It's a compensation for this kid of bringing about what she wants, but it's not real. Now, you could say that wish fulfillment is not adaptive, but sometimes in our life, such as in pretend play of kids, it might be adaptive in the sense that at least it helps you to cope while your needs are not really being met. And I think it worked that way for this kid. So next lecture we'll talk about the further development of this adaptive process. Thank you. Hello. In the last lecture, we introduced Freud's theory, and we talked about his basic functioning that he called the id. In this lecture, we're going to continue with Freud's theory, and we're going to cover the basic parts or processes of mental functioning or the personality, talk about the id again and its relation to the ego and also the superego and how they function together. And then we'll discuss ego defense mechanisms and give some examples of how the ego functions, how it can sometimes also be maladaptive. As we discussed in the last lecture, the id is a term that Freud gave to that part of our mental processes that is the source of libidinal energy or psychological energy. And the id functions through using the libidinal energy to try to meet the basic needs of the individual. Because the id is wholly unconscious and irrational in its functioning, it doesn't really adapt to the demands of reality. Now you can see examples of this irrationality, and they can be included in wish fulfillment as an attempt to reduce drives and gain pleasure. If a person's hungry, it doesn't discriminate between effectively actually eating food and ineffectively sucking or dreaming about food or fantasizing about food. However, it's these very irrational actions that usually lead to the frustration and the unmet needs that really make the difference in development. You see, empty sucking or thinking about food just doesn't fill your stomach. And these needs then force a person to begin adjusting to reality. And it's with this need to be more successful at meeting our needs comes the dawning of consciousness, comes a reality orientation. Now, my guess is, knowing what we know about humans today, we become more and more conscious after birth, and it probably is sort of a biological unfolding. But Freud was either lucky or very astute in his observations that to see that babies, when they're born, are for the most part unconscious. We know today, I don't think he knew this at the time, we know today when newborns are first born and for the first couple of weeks, on average, they spend about 4 hours sleeping for every 7 minutes that they spend awake. And when they're awake, sometimes it's in a sort of a drowsy condition. They are conscious, but there isn't a heck of a lot of real conscious time. And that's aside from all the unconscious processing that he's already talking about. So in a Freudian sense, you could say that it's the frustration, the lack of adaptability of the id that forces us to really become conscious and to become reality-oriented. And the ego is the term that Freud gave to that part of mental processes that becomes conscious and deals with rational problem solving. Now, do you remember that I said when Freud gave the term for the id, in the original German, it was the it. In the original German, the word for the ego was ich, the I. And I like the original German better because he talked about the it part of us versus the I part of us. And the implications that I thought were very clever was that the it implies that we have no self-concept. It's just an it. There's no sense of identity. But the second part, the I, implies that we have a developing self-concept. We're somebody. We have an identity. And I think that's what he was trying to capture. Anyway, the I, or the ego, is what we call this reality part. In Freud's conceptualization, the emergence of the ego and consciousness then is the direct result of the id and primary processes being so darn maladaptive and inefficient at meeting our basic needs. So the ego then channels some of the libido, the psychic energy, from the id and uses it to function and develop problem-solving processes. Remember, the id has all of the libido. But now we channel off some of that libido, that libidinal energy, and we try to solve problems. And Freud called then that the way of thinking, the processes of the ego, secondary process thinking, as opposed to the primary process thinking of the id. Secondary only because it came second to the primary process thinking. Secondary process thinking is reality-oriented. This thinking then involves the reality principle, whereas for the primary process thinking of the id, it involves the pleasure principle, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. The reality principle is trying to solve problems, to find an effective way to get what you want, to actually taking the actions. So, as an example, now, when a person's hungry, she doesn't just suck or fantasize, but she attempts to get food. So for a baby, that means you cry, but you do an instrumental kind of crying. You try to get the parent's attention. You try to do things to get the parent to feed you. For an older child, it might mean go to the refrigerator, for heaven's sakes, and make yourself a sandwich. Don't just sit and think about it and fuss. That's the ego. And with this conscious processing, one also learns what actions might lead to harm and punishment. Because now that you're in touch with reality, you might learn that even though you have a certain need, and therefore you have this drive state, if you do take certain actions, this may get you in big trouble. Somebody will punish you, or you may get hurt. So one learns to postpone gratification. And one of the jobs then of the ego is to learn delay of gratification in order to develop appropriate means to attain what you need. So often, the immediate demands of the drives of the id and the demands of reality, the demands of trying to solve problems, come into conflict. Can you see that? id really wants it now. It's irrational. It wants everything and it wants it now. And the ego is trying to work things out so you don't get in trouble and it's effective. So often, libidinal energy is driving simultaneously both pleasure seeking of the id and problem solving of the ego. You can see where Freud now is getting at these conflicting motivations and emotions that we have. So as the ego develops and as it becomes stronger, it takes on the role of the controlling structure to help the person adapt and to cope. It becomes the controller. And in doing this, the ego often suppresses the drives of the id. The id, in return, channels its demands and its drives into various forms. It often camouflages these drives, these demands, so that they can pass by the ego. Now, we talk like this because Freud talked like this. I don't think the id is there making executive decisions about how, well, if I can't get it out this way, I'll camouflage it this way. Remember, the id is not rational. It's like a pressure place having needs and demands. And if these needs and demands can't be met, they take another form. They're forced to come out some other way. Okay, so let's say as an adult, I really don't like somebody, but I have to control my anger and my emotions. And so what I end up doing, I can't do what maybe the id would like to do, is destroy this person. So what I end up doing is it comes out maybe in dreams in an unconscious way. And in my dream, I'm talking to the person. Maybe I'm competing with the person, but I'm not fighting. And that's what I mean by a camouflage, or another form that it might take. Because another example, let's say you want to have sex with somebody. But the demands of reality, the ego says, sorry, you can't do that, not right now. And so unconsciously, you might not even be aware that you're doing this. Unconsciously, you start seeing the other person as somebody who needs a lot of help. And you go over and you help her paint her house. And you help her out in ways. And that's the way it sort of comes out. So eventually, and according to Freud, through the resolution of the Oedipal conflict, which we're not going to talk about today, but we'll talk about in the next lecture. But through the resolution of this Oedipal conflict, an individual internalizes parental standards, and with them society standards. And this forms the third part or process of our whole mental processing system. And Freud called this the superego. He called it the Über-Ich, or the super I. So superego is a pretty good term for it. So now you have the id, the ego, and this superego that comes about as really a way of society and these standards being taken inside. The superego, in effect, has two parts, as Freud saw it. The first part is called the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is the view that we've incorporated of how we should be ideally, how we should behave, and how we should function. In a sense, it's our ideal model for ourselves. This part we can hold up as our standard. So my ego ideal might include that I'm a kind, generous person, that I am always honest, that I'm competent in my job, I'm a great father, I'm a great husband, or some other aspects of my ego ideal. And actually, we can use this ideal as a way of comparing how we're really functioning and how we're doing, and strive constantly to achieve our ideal. The second part of the superego is called the conscience. And the conscience is really a process that we use to really judge how we're doing in how we're living up to our ego ideal. So the conscience is a way of saying, ooh, you're really not like your ideal, or you're doing a pretty good job in that way you were. The conscience then drives a person to reward the person or punish the person based on how well or how poorly that person's doing in achieving the ego ideal. Freud believed this. Freud believed that in some unconscious ways, we do reward and punish ourselves through this process of this superego working. For example, if I do a really kind deed, I may feel very proud and have a good feeling for the rest of the day. Who knows? Later in the day, not even aware of this, I may get a dessert that I normally wouldn't get. And Freud would argue that in some ways, on an unconscious level, I'm rewarding myself with these good feelings. And I'm rewarding myself maybe by letting myself do some things, get some rewards. But let's say I lose control of my anger. First, I lose control of things that I think should be kept in. And I do some things that come out. And in the process, I feel extremely guilty. And for the rest of the day, I just feel lousy. I can't always put a finger on it. And in fact, I may even get sick. Or maybe if this continues, I might have an accident and get hurt. So Freud argued that the conscience, and our superego, if you will, can actually punish us even to have things that we're not aware of, to be accident prone, to be more prone to illness, as well as feeling guilty and feeling lousy. So in that way, the superego is constantly sort of rewarding and punishing us to try to get us in line with the way we should be as we've taken it in from the outside, from society. The superego is partly conscious, but it's also partly unconscious. Unlike the ego, which is really the part of us that deals with reality and consciousness. And therefore, the superego is also not always rational and not always reality-oriented. It may come from society, but once it gets inside us, if it becomes too strong, it really distorts reality. And it can become maladaptive, just like the id can. You see, the superego can cause conflicts with both the id and the ego. It's definitely trying to block some of the ego's demands. It's trying to block some of the id's demands. So in Freudian terms, for a person to develop a healthy personality and also to be most adaptive, the ego has to become the strong member, the strong part of our personality or our processing. It has to be so developed that it can become a mediator, a strong mediator between the id, the superego, and the demands of reality. So in Freudian terms, having a strong ego does not have the negative connotations that we have today. That is, if you say in Freud's terms, somebody has a strong ego, you don't mean that they're egotistical or they're a braggart, but you mean that they're very adaptive, that they're in balance, that they have control, that they're very reality-oriented. See, that connotation has changed. We use that word ego a lot, taken from Freud, but we've changed the meaning. When you say somebody has a strong ego today, I think you realize we don't always mean something positive. Freud did. There are examples of this in real life that you can give. Let me give you one that's a little extreme, but to point it out. This happens to me. This probably doesn't happen to you, but I'll use me as an example. Let's say sometime I'm walking down the street and I see this woman who's a very good-looking woman. Now, in an unconscious kind of way, my id sees her, and my id says, woman, sex, get her, have it now. And my ego says, no, don't do that. You'll get arrested. That's crazy. You're going to have major problems. Don't do that. Look, if you really want her, just hold on. We'll try to get to know her. Maybe we can find out who she is. Let's go talk to her. Let's send her flowers. And the superego is saying, never, never, you dirty old man. So there's this constant struggle. And the poor little ego is in the middle, trying to balance everything from the demands of reality, from the id, and from the superego. Now, I just personified everything as if these little people inside me having this battle. Well, we can't help that. Freud did that. He had these strange personifications. He gave everything names. He talked as if they're, duking it out inside you, and there's these executives in there making these decisions. I don't think he believed that. But it was a handy way of trying to describe it. And in fact, sometimes we've taken this over as reality. For example, there's been science fiction movies made, B-grade science fiction movies, of draining off somebody's id and using their id as a person, as a monster, to go and attack them. That's what comes from this personification. Nevertheless, does this seem real to you? Forget the personification. Does this ever happen to you? I'm hoping it does. I'm hoping I'm not the only one. That very often, it seems like you really do have these mixed motivations, these conflicts. Part of you just wants to hang out, let it all hang out. Get what you want, get it now. Why should you have to be concerned? And part of you is saying, no, I have to take account of what's reasonable, keep control. And part of you is saying, no, you should be perfect. You shouldn't want those things. And sometimes there's these mixed feelings. So very often we may feel that we have conflicting needs and demands and drives that we have that are real. That we have these real conflicting drives. I think Freud was astute enough to pick up on some of these conflicts that I think we really have. But the id, the ego, the superego, they're all part of our personality. They're all part of our processing. So don't think of them so much as little separate compartments, but think of them as just the names he gave for the different kinds of functions and processes that go on inside us, inside of our mind, inside of our processing. Sometimes actions or strategies are used by the ego to handle these conflicts, and these actions and strategies become maladaptive. Remember, the poor little mediator ego in the middle is trying to work things out. But there are times when, in working things out, in keeping things under check, you might pick methods that work in part but cause more trouble than they're worth. And then that way may be maladaptive. And Freud called these various processes ego defense mechanisms. They're processes or methods that ego develops for resolving these internal conflicts. And one example is commonly found, a defense mechanism that's maybe the most common, is called repression. In this process, the person simply represses any conscious thoughts or awareness of a conflict or drive. So, for example, a person may have a strong sexual attraction to another person, but the other person may be a taboo object of affection. So, I may have a strong desire for, not me, you. You may have a strong desire for a minor or for a married person not married to yourself. And that's not appropriate. And so one way for the ego to handle that is to just repress all of those drives, all of those feelings. You forget them. You don't have them in your memory. You're not aware of them. And thus the drives of the id are completely blocked and repressed. Maybe you had a traumatic experience happen to you and you were really scared. It was so painful, it's so hard, that you don't remember it. You completely repress it. Maybe you had some really negative, selfish feelings towards something, but you're not aware of them. You block them. So repression is kind of a blocking. There's also a second common defense mechanism called projection. And in this case, the person controls these drives from the id by attributing the conflict or the drive to someone else rather than to oneself. So, for example, a person may have feelings of hate and aggression towards somebody else, but these unconscious drives, because they're so negative and can't come out, the person translates this into believing it's the other person who hates oneself and is aggressive. Say, I don't dislike this person. I don't hate this person. I'm not acting aggressively. She's the one that hates me. She doesn't like me. And she's doing all this stuff. So you turn it, you project it onto somebody else. You project these feelings onto somebody else. And this is the way it sort of comes out, or it gets you in trouble, but the argument is, in a Freudian sense, this defense mechanism is not too adaptive. It's not really too in touch with reality, even though it has a controlling effect on the conflicts. Last lecture I gave you this boiler pot model. Let me return to this. Picture again, we have this big iron pot filled with libidinal energy, and it's coming out, it's being channeled out in different ways through our drives, and it's meeting different needs. And the ego's trying to control some of these drives because they're not appropriate, or we can't meet them now. So think of these defense mechanisms of ways of channeling the energy or the drives. In one case, with repression, you just put a plug over the valve, over the pipe. You block it off and you don't let it out. In another case, what happens though when you block things off? The pressure builds. Something's going to happen. You can't just block things off. So in another case, in projection, let's shut it off this way and blow all your energy onto somebody else. Let's shut it off this way and say it's this person's problem over here, not yours. So there are different ways and mechanisms that you handle these kinds of pressures, this pressure cooker, if you will. Let me talk about a third kind of defense mechanism. And this is really one that's quite adaptive, that Freud actually liked, and it makes sense. And it's called sublimation. Now, in sublimation, a person channels the various dangerous or taboo drives, the unacceptable drives, towards an acceptable goal. So in some ways it's a lot like projection, but in this case you channel it towards something good. Now there's some examples of this. Let's say a person again has this overly strong sex drive. Let's say it's a man who wants women. But in the sublimation process, he takes his energy, all of his libidinal energy, and puts it into painting beautiful pictures of women. Pictures that others appreciate and can value and are very aesthetic. Or let's say this same person who has this same sex drive channels all this energy into doing valuable medical research on sexual dysfunctions. So I don't want to be a complete crazy Freudian, but maybe Masters and Johnson had strong sex drives that were then sublimated into doing us a lot of good. Maybe even Freud sublimated his drives to come up with his theory, his valuable theory. Well, is this true? Is this how things work? For a lot of people, this makes sense. There's an inherent sense in this, that very often we take energy from one source, sublimate it, and use it and channel it towards productive ends in our life. And what Freud was trying to say was the source, the initial source of the motivation might not always be altruistic or what it seems on the surface. It may have come from still come from the basic drives he's talked about. But after all, that's how we function in society. That's a good way to learn to function. One thing you could argue is very often artists of different types might do good work when they're highly emotional, when there are problems, when there are stresses or issues that bring about this kind of emotionality. And that would fit in with Freud's sublimation view. So for Freud, there are many far-reaching human endeavors that are motivated by these basic drives, and they are either adaptive or maladaptive based on the way these three parts of one's mental processing develop. Now, when the ego's in charge, the drives can be met in very appropriate ways. But maladaptions can also happen, and we can have some extremely inappropriate ways. Let me just give you a brief example of one. Some of the recent research that I'm doing in my own studies is on the antecedents or development of aggression and violence in children and adolescents. What factors together as patterns lead to aggression and violence? We didn't use Freudian theory as a basis for this. This is not part of our thinking, but there's one finding we have that could fit in here. We expected that maybe kids who were really outgoing, risk takers, boisterous, sort of the extrovert types might be the ones that are most likely to be aggressive if it's paired with other things, with other problems in their life. And we did a longitudinal study in which we looked at children, a lot of children, starting when they were in school, in elementary school age, and tracing them now until they're now in middle and late adolescence, to find out the different factors in their life that might predict which ones become really aggressive and which ones don't. We have all kinds of kids from different racial and ethnic groups and such. And what we've found so far, and this part's predictable, is that the kids that have been exposed to a lot of violence towards themselves in their lives end up being ones that are more aggressive. So if they've been abused by their parents, if they've been harshly physically punished, they become more aggressive. If they've been victimized by others, they become more aggressive. If they see more violence, they become more aggressive. That part isn't too surprising. The interesting part is when you pair this kind of exposure to violence towards them, particularly from the family, when you pair that with being inhibited, these are the kids that are the most aggressive in our study. When I say inhibited, I mean kids who are bottled up. They show a real high fear and anxiety about school. They don't like new situations. They have a hard time with change. They have a hard time with new kinds of food. They have a hard time with social contacts. They don't like to speak up. I'd say they were shy, but that's too simple. They're closed, they're inhibited, if you will, in behaving, in responding. I would say the best term is they're anxious and they're bottled up. And when you take this bottled up kind of kid and pair it with this exposure to violence, they become the most aggressive. And at first we thought, isn't that sort of strange? But in fact, the pattern we find sort of goes along with what we've seen in recent school shooters. Because in the school shooters, we find kids who are also bottled up and inhibited and often not outgoing and not so much fitting in, exposed also to taunting and victimization to others. There's some evidence it even may go along with what we'd call a terrorist kind of approach. Well, you don't really need Freud to explain all of this, but it's interesting to me that we have something like a maladaptive defense mechanism. The kid is holding in and bottling up everything, and it's a pressure cooker. And sometimes it explodes and comes out as aggression. So there's a case of some recent research that actually fits in with what Freud said about the maladaptive nature that sometimes occurs with defense mechanisms. Well, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about Freud's famous psychosexual stages and his famous Oedipus complex and how that relates then to children's development. Thank you.